Hello and welcome to my channel. This is a story about what if Naruto were a Senju. Let's begin this alternative reality. All your ninja belong to Kishimoto. Eventually there will be spoilers through the most current volume of the manga. Senju Naruto Prologue, Life-Altering Events. Tsunade Hime. What are you doing here? The newly appointed Yondaime Hokage greeted his sensei's old teammate. Beside him on a bar stool, the toad sage was slumped over and softly snoring. He'd been out just long enough for a small pool of drool to start forming under his gaping mouth. It was relatively disgusting. The Yondaime was careful to keep the sleeve of his flame-trimmed coat from touching the slobbery mess. "Shouldn't I be asking you that?" she quipped, while taking a slightly unsteady seat on the other side of the unconscious Senin. She casually tossed her long blonde ponytails over her shoulders. After all, this dump is nearly a day's travel from Konoha. Don't you have a village to run? She quickly snatched what was left of the bottle of sake Jiraiya had been working on when he passed out, rescuing it before it could be tainted by the growing puddle. Hey, Minato scratched the back of his head in slight embarrassment. Well, the old man's got it covered for now. Eros-sensei thought we should go out and celebrate my appointment to Yondaime, and wouldn't stop badgering me about it even though he knows I don't drink. I finally had to agree on the condition that if he was going to get drunk and make me look bad, we do it where no one we know will see us. A sheepish grin spread across his face, a sweep of his hand taking in the water glass in front of him and the multitude of empty bottles surrounding his mentor like tiny cylindrical soldiers guarding his drunken sleep. I'm kind of a role model or something now, you know. On the upside, he agreed to lay off the peeping for the next few weeks if I came along and had at least one cup of sake. This way I'll have one less nuisance to deal with while I settle into the job. Tsunade's grin slipped a bit as she offered him the now slightly more empty bottle from which she'd just poured herself a drink. Well, it doesn't look like you've held up your end of the bargain very well, Minato-kun. Don't you feel like celebrating the achievement of your dream? He blinked in confusion for a minute, thrown off a bit by the odd note of grief in her voice, before realizing her comment was in regards to the lack of a sake saucer in front of him. Oh. Well, it's a little embarrassing, but I really can't hold my liquor. He blushed a bit, then continued, I figured I'd just let him drink himself stupid, and he'd never know if I'd actually had any or not. His sheepish grin reminded her of Dan and her brother both, whom she had loved, and who wanted to become Hokage, but their dream had died with them, and Minato had achieved it instead. You know, a man should never go back on his words, was all she could think to say around the growing lump in her throat. Her grief was still as sharp now as it had been when she'd left the village. She hadn't really thought about how she might feel seeing someone else given the title of Yondaime when the two she'd loved and supported so much would never be the leaders or protectors of anything again. Minato stared on in unmitigated horror as the lower lip of the usually ridiculously strong, drunken woman beside him began to tremble and her eyes got big and damp. If there was one thing that really disturbed the Yondaime, it was a ninja, especially a kunoichi, or a kitten, but that's an entirely different story in emotional distress. He could take down whole armies of rock ninjas single-handedly, but tears he just could not deal with. His usually sharp and strategic mind always short-circuited at the first signs of watery eyes, and then he'd begin to babble whatever random came into his head. This frequently made the situation worse instead of better, as the words weren't going through his brain for proper vetting, and Namikaze Minato wasn't naturally the most tactful person in the world. On top of that, crying things made his insides wibble, and a man's insides should never go wibbly. It wasn't manly. If Stone or any of the other hidden villages ever learned of his ultimate weakness, all of Konoha would be doomed. When he'd talked it over with Sarutobi-sama, he couldn't, in good conscience, let himself be named Hokage with such a huge and easily exploited Achilles heel without disclosing it to the old man first. He'd seemed to think it wouldn't affect his ability to function as the village's leader. Unfortunately, while diplomats and enemies on a battlefield weren't likely to turn into sobbing, emotional wrecks in front of him, it seemed as though his sensei's former teammate, at least when she was heavily inebriated, which was pretty frequently now, had no compunctions about it. She'd begun to sniffle alarmingly on top of the trembling lip and doe eyes. Immediately his mind turned off in self-defense, and his mouth started emergency tactics to try and curb the impending emotional Armageddon. To his future woe, he had no idea why his unwillingness to drink alcohol had made her so upset, so he had to do the only thing he could think of to alleviate his perceived reason for her sudden mood shift. He immediately accepted the bottle she was still offering. Before he could think about it any further, he found himself quickly downing it while alternately sputtering in distaste, babbling about how he'd never go back on his word ever again, and waving his free hand desperately in a fending-off sort of gesture. Completely forgetting her troubles at the strange sight before her, Tsunade immediately broke into drunken giggles. "Slow down, boy, you're going to choke. I thought you didn't drink. But you said." Minato blinked at the now empty bottle in his hand and shook it a little in bewilderment as his brain kicked back in. Phew. Crisis averted. "I don't," but he cut himself off again with a slightly confused frown, the previous few moments having been blanked from his memory to reduce the trauma to his psyche. Tsunade's grin turned a bit predatory. "Don't worry about it, Minato-kun. Here, have some more. Maybe that will jog your memory." She ordered another round and poured for him before he could really think of a good protest. "Now, how about some cards?" "Cards, huh? I don't think you want to do that," Yondaime said, talking around the sake cup he hadn't taken from his lips since he'd picked it back up. It was easier to sit that way, after all. "I have completely weird luck with cards." "Weird luck, huh?" She frowned a bit jealously. How good could it be? She'd just have to get him good and soused before broaching the topic again. "Well, I know. Let's play a drinking game instead." Alarms immediately went off in his head, but unfortunately, he couldn't hear them over the happy humming of the "I Love Sake" song he'd just made up. Tsunade's grin turned a bit shark-like when her cute, blonde new drinking buddy nodded happily, the most adorable alcohol flush spreading over his nose to kiss his cheeks. Several bottles later, Tsunade decided Minato-kun looked awfully cute in the particularly seedy bar's dingy lighting, and he'd had the same dream as her other precious people, and he was already Hokage so he couldn't be hit by the curse if she got just a little close to him, right? Minato got progressively more and more Jiraiya-like as he drank. He hadn't been lying about his tolerance level. The alcohol hit his system like a small, underfed, little girl from the poorest regions of Mist Country instead of like the manly warrior he was. He thought Tsunade-chan had awfully nice and certainly didn't look anywhere near 40 with that awesome genjutsu of hers. Luckily, his words were so slurred by that point that she couldn't tell what he was saying, so his skull remained intact. An hour later, they left Jiraiya completely passed out at the bar and went back to Minato's room. In the morning, they both freaked out and agreed never to speak of, or even think about it again, as anything more specific than the incident, just in case someone developed some weird mind-reading jutsu and decided to try it out on two of the strongest ninja of the era. That might have been the end of it if Tsunade hadn't shown up a little over a month later in the village she vowed never to step foot in again and immediately knocked Konoha's newest Hokage through two walls and a convenient stack of empty crates. There's always a stack of crates when you need one. It's a law of the shinobi universe. Sandaime blinked and looked back and forth between the new holes in Hokage Tower and his wayward student. Fires of unholy rage were burning around her form and licking away at the ceiling. Shizune-chan was begging her to calm down and tugging ineffectually at her sleeve to keep her from following the Yondaime's trajectory to lay down more wrath of the heavens on his poor confused head. He looked across his desk at Jiraiya, but the Toad Sage seemed even more baffled than his mentor was. Probably because he couldn't believe he wasn't the target of Tsunade's violence for once. "Tsunade-chan, as happy as we are to see you back in the village, maybe you should explain what you are so angry about before you go after Minato-kun again. The Anbu get very nervous when the Hokage gets beaten up. They are supposed to be protecting him, you know." Minato had impeccable timing. His abused successor climbed back in through the wreckage his body had made of the tower, while holding his ribs as if they pained him quite a bit. His unruly hair was even more ruffled than usual and his coat had torn in several places on the crates that had broken his fall. It was pretty clear he had no idea why he'd just been convenient crate no jutsu ed. Unfortunately for him, it was obvious by her single-minded focus on the subject of her rage that Tsunade hadn't even heard her mentor. You complete and utter." Her hands shot out in terrible claws ready to strangle the poor fool who looked just as confused as the rest of them. Shizune managed to slow the advance of her master enough to let Jiraiya interpose himself between his teammate and his student. Jiraiya was never one of his brightest pupils. Sandaime sighed. "Hey, calm down and tell us what's going on." I don't know what you think Minato did to you, but I really think he's got to be innocent. He's been here the whole time and here the whole time, except the night he spent at that bar and even shittier inn with me. The bar and inn you dragged him to. The medic Nin verbally plowed over the top of Jiraiya in her rage, the night he got me pregnant. The heavy silence that fell over the five of them was perhaps only slightly lighter than the weight of the entire tower. Sandaime blinked. Well, this is surreal. Even Jiraiya had nothing to say to that, his jaw hitting the floor just like the other men in the room until, I guess I should have known you liked younger men. There had to be a reason you never seemed to fall for my manly charms. Sarutobi smacked his palm to his face, partly out of embarrassment and partly so he wouldn't have to see the dismemberment of someone he considered something like a son. Why you can't mean, Minato stuttered, the incident. There's no way. Tell that to my uterus you complete and utter. Minato spared a small part of his mind to feel sorry for his sensei as Tsunade continued to take her anger out on the resident super pervert while she screamed at him. Tsunade-sama, please calm down. All this stress can't be good for the baby. Shizune begged. Surprisingly, it seemed to get through to her understandably violent mentor who made a monumental effort to try and control herself, her fist clenched and white-knuckled, held trembling before her chest. Minato looked ready to faint and slowly lowered himself to the floor against the ruined wall of his office. Are you sure? Well, of course you're sure, you're a medic nin, but how well, of course I know how technically, but don't you have Urdu, or, well by all that's holy, what are we going to do? Tsunade's hard-won sliver of control seemed to be quickly evaporating. You'd better not be thinking beyond, who's it going to live with, and, how are we going to explain it to the council? Because if you're thinking I'm going to get rid of it. No, of course not. She seemed a little soothed by his quick and vehement reply. Minato is an orphan after all, Sandaime thought, and so he places a high value on family. He'd frequently talked about how he wanted one, though the old man rather thought he'd been planning to have it with that hot red-headed Anbu from Whirlpool rather than the hot-tempered blonde Sannin looming over him like holy retribution given form. Tsunade, herself, had lost every family member she'd ever had, barring Shizune who would have been her in-law if Dan had lived. She wanted family like people trapped in the Suna Desert wanted water if her fear of loss and overwhelming grief would only let her get close to people again. That was probably the only thing that had saved Minato's his membership card in the male club. She and Dan had planned to have kids right away, both really wanting children, and she'd thought that chance lost to her along with her lover. The old man grinned. While this certainly threw a wrench in the works of both of their plans for the future, it just might prove to be a really good thing for both of them. On top of that, what kind of children would two powerhouse shinobi like them produce? They'd be little monsters. Sandaime had visions of dandling amazingly strong warriors with like chakra control on his knees. He hid his growing smile behind his hand. This time the silence was thoughtful. Minato was smart enough not to suggest Tsunade move back to the village right away, and for him, leaving was out of the question. Tsunade was no doubt dealing with warring feelings of disappointment and hope. She'd probably wanted him to say she could have the kid, no strings attached, but the growing brightness Sandaime saw in the young man's eyes wouldn't have gone unnoticed by the expectant mother even if she'd managed to overlook his reputation as the most honest and responsible man alive. Her child was going to have a loving father if Minato had any say in the matter, and she wouldn't be able to bring herself to be resentful of that, regardless of the circumstances of his or her conception. Finally, the old man cleared his throat, drawing the attention of everyone in the room. Well, you've got over 7 months to think it over. You don't have to make a decision today. Why don't you all go and think about it a little more? Give the news time to settle in and the shock to fade a bit. Tsunade frowned. Sarutobi knew that look. It was her ridiculously stubborn one. I'm not staying in this cursed village 1 minute longer than necessary. She spat. Albeit grandfather's retreat on the border, but don't think this lets you off the hook. The two current Hokage watched her step on the slowly rousing Jiraiya on her way out. Shizune winced and hurried to follow her mentor, scooping Tauntaun up so the little pig didn't fall behind. Wow, I just had the most bizarre dream. You'd had a torrid one-night affair with Tsunade for some reason and managed to accidentally knock her up. The toad sage exclaimed, sitting up and rubbing at the large and painful lump on his head. Wow, Minato, those ribs look bad, maybe you should get them looked at. Sarutobi sighed again. It was a good thing his pupil had an amazingly thick skull, or he'd have been killed ages ago. After all, it was hard to dodge monstrously strong punches and thrown pieces of rubble the size of one's head while simultaneously trying to yank your own foot out of your mouth. Dealing with it, Tsunade ended up spending the entire duration of her pregnancy in the small cottage her grandfather had built with his Mokuden jutsu for when he needed to get away from the bustle of a growing Konoha. Shizune stayed with her, and Minato made it a point to visit at least once a day to bring them supplies and check up on the baby. His trips became more frequent when Tsunade took to throwing one of his Hiraishin kunai, left with them for emergencies every time she had a craving or just wanted to chew him out really good. The ingenious little seals inscribed on the three-pronged weapons let him know every time one was thrown, and he always showed up just in case this time it was important. Tsunade seemed to be entirely ignoring the fact that it took two to tango and was taking all of her frustrations and fear for the future out on Minato, but he couldn't work up the nerve to point that out to her. Her mood swings made rabid hungry weasels seem predictable and rational, and his manhood was already threatened more times than he was comfortable with as it was. Despite his predecessor's obvious hopes for them, Yondaime was pretty sure he and Tsunade would never get past a platonic sort of relationship. He frowned and idly tapped a pen against his desk as his shadow clones industriously read and signed off on paperwork throughout the room. There was the age gap to consider, but that was surmountable. It was Konoha itself that he was sure would always be their hurdle even if they could find some sort of common ground for affection, and he couldn't see any way around it. Regardless, his life was kind of on hold until they could figure out how to deal with all of this. He was really looking forward to being a father, but the situation constantly weighed on his mind. He was a man of action, charging in and getting things done. He'd never been forced to really put something this important on the back burner before, but he dreaded the confrontation that would resolve it, especially since he had no idea where he should really stand and what he should fight for out of the many issues surrounding this situation. He was a completely confused mess, and he knew it. If that wasn't enough, before all of this had happened, he'd been all set to finally go out with Whirlpool's Uzumaki Kushina, but he didn't really feel comfortable doing that when he couldn't be completely honest with her. Impending fatherhood is not really something you should start out a relationship hiding from your girlfriend, so he'd put her off with excuses about being busy with Hokage duties. Understandably, she was getting impatient, and not a little bit, since he'd been chasing her pretty hard until he'd found out about the baby. She'd probably decided he was a complete and moved on. He sighed. He couldn't really blame her, if she had, especially since he wasn't willing to risk a relationship with his child over anything, let alone a romance that wasn't even guaranteed to work. He had no delusions that Tsunade wouldn't bring it up romantic entanglements when they finally couldn't put this particular fight off any longer. She was a brilliant woman, and he really felt like he needed to have all his ducks in a row if he wanted to get along congenially with the mother of his son or daughter and have any hope of convincing her he deserved access to the child just as much as she did. If he had to give up Kushina to be a parent, then so be it. It wouldn't really be fair to her to drag her into this mess anyway. That being said, he'd be damned if he let Tsunade run off with his son or daughter, but he was sure she'd never agree to stay. Despite the lack of death and destruction during her most recent stay in the village, she was still adamant that she would never raise a child that close to Konoha, and he was sure she'd never be happy staying in Shodai's retreat. The hidden village of the Leaf would forever be associated with taking from her everything she ever cared for, and she'd never feel comfortable with her kid so close to what she perceived as a cursed death trap. Especially if the kid was to frequently visit his father there. She was already going stir-crazy in that small cabin. Minato sighed. He'd be lucky if she even managed to make it through the next few weeks until the birth. If Tsunade were to frequently take the baby out of the village, as much as it hurt him to even think of it, he had to consider that it might be best for the kid if his or her paternity wasn't even known to the general public. He had no illusions as to how safe a child of his would be without him there to protect it. He'd never forgive himself if some stone ninja went after his child in some twisted plot to get revenge on the Yellow Flash for his part in the Third Great Ninja War. Tsunade's reputation might serve to keep them off, but it might also make them even more determined not to let a child with that kind of pedigree reach an age where he could be dangerous. He wished he could talk to Kakashi about it. His student had grown up under the shadow of the White Fang and on more than one occasion had to deal with grief-crazed shinobi bent on revenge for things his father had done. He wanted to know how he dealt with it and how often it happened, how easily the plots were thwarted, that sort of thing. He couldn't confide in the boy though. He couldn't tell anyone until he and Tsunade could talk it out, and at this rate, the kid would be Godime by the time they both could even decide what it was they wanted. Yondaime's pen snapped at that thought and ink went spattering over everything. He cursed loudly then waved away the Anbu that came to investigate the commotion. Morosely he cleaned up the mess as best he could before turning back to the window and sinking back into his thoughts. He'd probably be getting along better with Tsunade if she hadn't taken to abusing the Hiraishin Kanai. He'd fallen off the ceiling once, been neck-deep in one of Jiraiya's swamps twice. Despite his occasional lack of self-preservation instincts, the sage knew when to just shut up and do it without asking questions. He'd been summoned under giant slugs, in piles of garbage, and on one memorable occasion, halfway in the oven. Which was on. For the most part, he was a good sport about it. She was carrying his baby, and he'd known better than to let her manipulate him into drinking that night. But it was getting really old and he'd had to come up with a lot of excuses for why he kept needing to procure new Hokage robes. Additionally, it was hard to have a rational conversation with someone when you were dealing with second-degree burns over the lower half of your body, even if they were letting their apprentice heal you right away. If that wasn't enough, he'd also been dealing with his Hokage duties, and someone had been setting the tailed beasts loose on various villages over the past few years. He'd had a side project going for a while now on something to counter it if it ever happened to Konoha, but he hadn't had a chance to work on it in months. It would probably work, but it would definitely kill whoever tried to use it, and it still required a sacrifice to seal the demon in, which was absolutely unacceptable in Yondaime's mind. He was unceremoniously jerked out of his thoughts when the tower began to shake a little, and off in the distance, in the exact direction of the Shodime's retreat, the sky burned red. Oh please no. Kyuubi had the nerve to go rampaging through her grandfather's cottage, a small house that had stood testament to her ancestors' amazing skill with Mokuden Jutsu since the founding of Konoha. She'd had a lot of fond childhood memories of that place. What's more, the Ninetales had the utter gall to do it when she was just over 8 months pregnant and miles away from any defenses aside from Shizune, whose poisons wouldn't do squat against a several stories tall monster made entirely of the chakra embodiment of pure malice. Tsunade growled through the shooting pains in her back. She really did have the worst luck ever, and this sealed it. Konoha was definitely out to get her. We've got to keep going, Tsunade-sama. Shizune urged her, doing her best to support her staggering mentor as they fled the destruction Kyuubi was causing behind them. They'd gotten away from the house and started heading for the dubious safety of the village's walls in what had seemed like plenty of time. The giant oppressive cloud of hatred that preceded the demon along with his huge body, made it kind of hard to miss when he headed towards you. Unfortunately, the stress of his presence and the panicked flight from their refuge towards the last place in the world she'd ever feel safe had kicked the slug Sanin into premature labor. This, understandably, slowed them down quite a bit. Minato couldn't make his jutsu work 2 ways, could he? How much harder could that have been, huh? She gasped. They'd been outside when they'd felt the first waves of the Biju's killing intent and had been more focused on escaping than going back to the house for the Hiraishin Kanai, so even if the Yondaime had the foresight to make them work so they could summon other people to him, it wouldn't have done them much good. That bit was lost on Tsunade though, as she had very little room for rationalizing through a haze of pain and fear. Especially when her legs gave out from under her during a particularly strong contraction only moments after her last one had stopped. Damn it, we're not going to make it to the village, let alone the hospital. She gasped, you're going to have to deliver this brat here. It's got to be a son. No girl would be this rude and pushy. He's going to take after that of a father, I can tell. Try to stay calm, Tsunade-sama. If the baby's ready to come now, then there's nothing for it. Remember to breath, Shizune said. She'd been afraid something like this would happen. Of course I'm going to remember to breath. Tsunade gritted out through clenched teeth. Why do people always tell women in labor to do that? If I ever say that to someone, I want you to kick me. Her apprentice ignored her with practiced ease, as she did her best to clear a spot on the forest floor, and laid out her outer robe to try and make her mentor more comfortable. Together they managed to get Tsunade arranged as best as possible, but the situation was definitely less than ideal. The baby was early enough that he'd be small, so despite the fact that this was her first child, the birth was likely to be fast. They were fortunate that Tsunade was as far along as she was. The baby had a good chance of being healthy even if he was a bit early. There were medical jutsu which would have it set to rights in no time as long as he or she was developed to a certain point. The baby was crowning by the time Minato managed to find them. He ditched his Anbu guard, sending them to the front, while he went to find out what had happened to his unborn child. He assuaged the waves of guilt he'd been feeling for letting his personal concerns trump his duty to the village, by telling himself that his baby might be the solution to all of their problems. The idea of what he would do if they could manage to force the child to be born before it was too late made him slightly ill, and the horror of what would happen to his precious village and everyone inside it if they couldn't ward for supremacy in his mind. He refused to think about how he'd convince Tsunade it was necessary if they had to induce labor, just as he refused to believe the high probability that he might not find her alive. When he arrived in their little clearing to be met by the cries of his firstborn son and lack of resistance from his already very protective mother, well, that was it then. It had to be fate. There were no other women in the village due to naturally give birth soon enough, and all the current infants were older than a few hours into the world and so were unlikely to survive the process. His face was a mixture of sadness and the reflexive joy of all new fathers when he accepted the bundle of squirming infant from Shizune while the girl continued to work on her now unconscious master. It was easy to slip away and join Jiraiya and Gamabunta at the front lines. In the end, he supposed it didn't matter that they'd not made any concrete plans for their son's future before he actually arrived. There'd be very few choices now. He'd have to be satisfied with getting to hold a name and see the tiny wonderful face of his legacy before he gave his life for a village he knew very well might grow to hate their tiny savior, but what choice did he have? "Forgive me, Naruto," he murmured. As he lay dying after performing the massive sealing, he carefully kissed the top of his sleeping son's head and passed the baby to his sensei. He thought there might have been tears in Jiraiya's eyes, but his own vision was getting too hazy and he was too far gone for his usual panic response. "You're a godfather, sensei," he gasped. "Make sure they know your godson's a hero." And with those final words, the Yondaime died. By the time Tsunade got her first look at her baby, he'd already been given the unfortunate name of a hero from Jiraiya's new book, lost his overly noble father who didn't even have the decency to build up a respectable alcohol tolerance, and been saddled with the most perverted, freeloading, horrible godfather in the history of perverted, freeloading, horrible godfathers. She hoped this wasn't a sign that her son had inherited her luck. Shock from seeing blood of which she was phobic and giving birth less than a mile from where the most powerful of the tailed beasts had been tearing through the village's defenses hadn't been very good for her health, and she'd passed out rather quickly near the end of the ordeal. On the upside, she thought she'd somewhat come to grips with the blood thing, as this experience with it had brought her the most perfect, precious, bundle of blonde joy she'd ever seen. She'd managed to sleep through the trip back to Konoha, which had probably been pretty uncomfortable both for herself and Shizune, who'd had to carry her, and she'd also managed to miss the anxiety of knowing what that crazy was doing with her poor Naru-chan before she knew he'd come safely out of it. There was no way in she'd have agreed to it if she'd known, but she was happy to be spared the worry during the whole ordeal. This and the lingering discomfort of having just given birth, no matter how good your healer happens to be, probably saved quite a few lives in the aftermath of Tsunade learning just what she'd missed while she was out. An enraged Tsunade was something the shinobi of Konoha had learned to deal with, but an enraged Tsunade protecting her son was on an entirely different level, and something they wouldn't witness for many years to come. As it was, she was grumpy, but holding her small, but perfectly healthy but for the demon sealed in his belly son kept her from completely flying off the handle. In fact, a strange sense of contentment and peace had settled on her despite what Minato's actions might mean for their kid's future. The baby in her arms opened and closed his tiny fists and moved his head a little. It was the most adorable thing she'd ever seen. Tsunade quietly cooed at her son from their place on a rather uncomfortable cot in a little forgotten room in Hokage Tower. After the stunt his dad had pulled, there was no way she'd let herself be seen with an infant anywhere near Konoha for a rather long time. People might put two and two together and get Kyuubi vessel, and she wasn't having any of that, so her only option was hiding out for the duration of their stay here. Come to think of it, she was really glad they hadn't told anyone about the baby for a variety of reasons. A. No one was supposed to know Kyuubi had been sealed into a kid, and therefore everyone knew and wanted to kill it, and B. Letting the world know the greatest medic nin in history and granddaughter of the Shodaime had procreated, however accidentally, with Konoha's infamous yellow flash, directly relating the boy to all but one of the Leafs, known for its strongest ninja, and one of its Sannin was probably ranked pretty high up there on the bad idea scale. Really strong ninja tended to collect really strong enemies like old men collected stamps. Tsunade inwardly cursed Minato, despite the fact that it wasn't good to think or speak ill of the dead. He might as well have painted a giant bullseye on poor Naru-chan along with the fancy seal. Hopefully, if she played her cards right and managed to get out of Konoha without anyone the wiser, everyone would just think she had become another one of the many kunoichi who decided to have a kid of her own without unnecessarily tying herself down to someone else. That kind of thing wasn't exactly an oddity in a world full of highly independent women who were trained to have illicit affairs for information and infiltration purposes or hold on to clan positions which needed heirs without the complications of marriage and possible loss of political power to a spouse not of their blood. It wasn't uncommon at all for high-ranking and politically powerful women to have children and give them the maternal family name, so if they played their card right, Senju Naruto shouldn't raise too many eyebrows. For the second point, ideally most people would just assume that the Kyuubi kid was just some random brat pulled off the street rather than the son of two of their most prestigious heroes. When he failed to make his presence known, they'd no doubt think that he disappeared, probably killed by someone who didn't want to take credit for it and get himself executed for breaking the soon-to-be-announced fourth law of secrecy. No one knew his name or what the infant had looked like, bundled up as he'd been on the battlefield. So as long as they didn't have to see him and be reminded of the terrifying force of nature held at bay in such a tiny, fragile body, human nature dictated that they'd probably be quick to forget about him. Out of sight, out of mind. Celebrate Naruto-kun's birthday on his original due date, and presto, no one the wiser. After all, everyone knew Tsunade had a huge aversion to returning to her home village, so it would seem unlikely that she and her newborn son would have been there during the attack. If her kid happened to look a great deal like Konoha's favorite martyred Hokage, well, his mother was blonde too, and she'd been through lots of places with predominantly blue-eyed people in her travels. Maybe his father was from Lightning Country. The coloring wasn't that uncommon over there. Her fierce grin slipped a bit as she took in all the ways her baby obviously took after his father. Though still a bit red, it was evident that his complexion would be darker than hers, and that bright shade of yellow hair was all Minato. She'd be willing to bet his eyes were going to brighten up rather than darken when they settled into his adult color. If you ignored the whisker-like birthmarks on his cheeks, he'd probably end up being a tiny Yondaime clone. She sighed, well, at least those aren't likely to give him away either. Lots of ninja families have weird markings. Just look at an Inuzuka. Looking at Naruto, it was hard to believe the Yondaime was gone and her sweet little baby was the jailer for a massive, malevolent demon. The cheeky blonde punk had been a constant annoyance and source of anxiety for her for the last several months, but she had faith in Minato's ability with seals, and even more faith in his love for his son. After all, she'd had to deal with his constant cooing at her stomach, babbling of possible baby names, including the one he'd stuck the kid with, that Jiraiya. It was somehow his fault, she was sure, and for the sake of little Naruto, now sleeping so peacefully in her arms, he'd even put up with her messing with him by summoning him in as many different, uncomfortable, and embarrassing situations as she could think of with that trick kunai of his. She'd never given him a chance, she realized, too worried about him demanding to keep their baby and with his village behind him, having the power to take yet another bit of her family away from her. It was extremely ironic that now, he was the one who'd never get to see his little boy grow up. Looking out the window at the city Minato had sacrificed himself to save, the same city all her loved ones gave their lives for, as it struggled to deal with its devastating losses and revive itself from the wreckage, she couldn't help but feel a little uneasy about her decision to totally alienate herself and her son from Konoha. She'd never seen before what was so great about it that they all had felt it was worth their lives to govern and protect. But both she and Minato had been born here, grown up here, been ninja here, and though many of her loved ones had died here too, this village had given her Naruto, and in a way, her losses had been a part of that. If she hadn't been feeling so sorry for herself that night, she'd never have fallen into bed with Jiraiya's prize pupil. Maybe someday, if he wanted it really badly, she'd let Naruto come back long enough to become a ninja of the leaf. Knowing her luck, odds were the kid would be genetically predisposed for obsession with Hokagehood anyway. What was the point of fighting against inevitability? But definitely not until he could properly defend himself, at least Chunin level, maybe Junin, or Anbu. No, he'd definitely have to be Sannin level first. She nodded to herself, yeah, that was reasonable, no one could fault her for that logic. What do you think, Naru-chan? She whispered to her sleeping son, should we go wake up Shizune and get out of this hole? Naruto slept soundly in reply, after all, he was a newborn, they really only had 3 modes at that stage of development. She took this for tacit agreement. Tsunade levered herself up off of the cot, careful not to jostle the tiny bundle in her arms, and padded silently towards the door. Jiraiya, when he'd had a chance to stick his head in earlier, had informed her that her apprentice had fallen asleep almost as soon as she'd drugged them into the tower. She'd been exhausted from stress, the birth, and healing Tsunade in its aftermath, not to mention the amount of effort it had taken to be stealthy while trying to get them to hiding without being seen by anyone in the general confusion. She'd been given the room next to Tsunade's so she wasn't too hard to find. Once informed of the situation, Shizune was extremely apologetic about the whole, handed your baby to a man who sealed a demon in him, thing, but in her frantic efforts to save her master she hadn't really thought twice about giving the baby to his father to hold. Who could blame her? Well, Tsunade could, and it would have been ages before Shizune lived it down enough to be trusted to babysit her precious Naru-chan if infants had been allowed in bars and/or casinos. As it was, in the years to come she got plenty of one-on-one time with her beloved adopted nephew. A little over a year later. No, Naru-chan. Don't chew on that. That's Ka-san's lottery ticket. Tsunade scolded her precocious toddler. The kid had a knack for physical things and getting into trouble. He'd rolled over early, crawled early, and started walking almost immediately after. From the way he was eyeing the tops of the shelves in the convenience store they'd stopped in to buy supplies, she knew it wouldn't be long before he was scaring the out of her by seeing how many things he could fall off of without breaking his head. He undoubtedly took after his father. There wasn't a self-preservation bone in his little body. Shizune liberated the now soggy bit of paper from her nephew's mouth and frowned to see he'd managed to scratch off a bit of it. The poor guy was teething like mad and nothing was safe from his tiny fangs. He had, oddly enough, gotten his canines in before his front teeth. Tsunade juggled her purchases while trying to put her wallet away and stared fondly at her apprentice and son. Shizune was taking a closer look at the ragged ticket while trying to keep Naruto from grabbing it back in chubby fists. Suddenly her eyes grew large and she exclaimed, Tsunade-sama. You won. What? She nearly dropped the bags of groceries she'd just paid for. Let me see. Technically, the kid just won. The amused store clerk pointed out, he's the one that scratched it off. You've got quite a lucky little guy there, yes, you do. Who's a lucky little guy? Babies turned most people into even larger idiots than they normally were. It was Tsunade's rule of the universe number 46. She was working on a theory that the maternal or paternal instincts in adult humans overrode at least 20 of their normal brain function when in the presence of miniature versions of themselves. The vocabulary centers were the first to go. No one was immune. Orange. Naruto cheered, that being his favorite all-purpose word. He used it for everything for which he had no existing vocabulary and sometimes for things he just thought were more orange than whatever the rest of the world felt they should be named. He'd even called Jiraiya orange until his mother had taught him the word pervert. Finally able to set the bags down. Without upsetting anything, the legendary sucker snatched the winning ticket from Shizune's hand and stared at it. I'll be damned. Well, it was only fair, she supposed, in the cosmic scheme of things, if the kid got his dad's recklessness, it should be balanced out with proportionally good luck. Somehow, this didn't make her feel better. Probably because Naruto had begun eagerly pointing to the tops of shelves again, and yelling, orange. Excitedly, Tsunade handed the ticket back to the clerk to cash it out and wasn't surprised when the woman didn't even flinch at its kind of disgusting state. She would have had to stop cooing ridiculously at a dumbfounded Naruto in order to notice. She and Shizune always made it a point to talk to the kid as if he were a real person whenever they could free themselves from the baby effect. This caused Naru-chan to be supremely confused when other adults babbled in length at him in high-pitched, nonsense phrases for great lengths of time as the store clerk was doing. He got the most adorable look on his face and those huge blue eyes blinked several times as if he were trying to puzzle out what kind of strange disease she had and if it were contagious. "What that?" he asked, pointing at the starry-eyed woman as his mother pocketed his winnings and picked up the bags of groceries again. "That's a babbling moron, Naru-chan. Can you say, moron? Sensei. Stop teaching my nephew to insult people." Orange. They left the store to the indignant sputtering of the offended woman behind the counter. Back at the small house they were renting by the month, Tsunade took Naruto from her apprentice while Shizune went to put the supplies away. With a somewhat steady income generated by the lack of a blood phobia preventing Tsunade and Shizune from privately hiring out their healing services or working at local hospitals or clinics whenever they needed Ryo, they'd taken to staying in places for much longer than they'd been used to because all the parenting books said kids needed stability. She was pretty sure the authors of the books had never seen a baby thrive on absolutely everything like Naruto did. He wasn't scared of a thing and absolutely loathed routine. Every time he had a new experience, or they went somewhere he'd never been before, he near wet himself in excitement. He was the single most vibrant and simply alive thing she'd ever run across. There was no way something as terrible as the Nine Tails could be influencing the brat. He wouldn't know hatred if it walked up to him and started making faces and babbling like that store clerk. She hadn't seen a single sign of the Kyuubi influencing her son's actions, and she'd been looking. She wanted to be ready if they had to track down Jiraiya and get him to look at the seal. So far, the early teething and whiskered birthmarks were the only things that even showed her son wasn't a normal, unpossessed, baby. The seal was always visible, which worried her a little since Jiraiya had seemed to think it should only show up when his chakra was active, but his energy flow was really steady for a toddler's, something that ran in her family, and she hadn't ever sensed the demon at all. Of course, that also contradicted Jiraiya's theories about the seal. He'd seemed pretty sure the fox would manage to throw Naru's control Alta by constantly throwing bits of his chakra into the normal coils, a downside to the seal's natural, built-in ability to slowly merge the power of the Biju with the boy over time. If that were the case, Tsunade's medic senses should have been able to feel it, at least every now and then, but she hadn't noticed even the normal spurts and starts most children, at least those not directly descended from the Shodaime, seemed prone to. Unfortunately, she wasn't a Hyuga, so she couldn't be sure what exactly was going on, but a few of her jutsu could give her a pretty good picture, and it seemed to her that the toddler's body was dealing with his prisoner much better than expected. Nevertheless, she'd put the word out that she wanted to see her old teammate about something important, and she expected him to show up looking for free food and board anytime now. Naruto yawned as they padded through the house and she decided to put him down for a nap. He usually balked at naps like you had suggested he bathe in filth instead of rest for an hour or two, but he was still only a baby and he got sleepy in the afternoons. They'd found if they didn't mention the word, nap, and just sort of wandered around the house holding him until he dozed off, it saved everyone a lot of accusatory exclamations of, orange, and heart-wrenching pouty faces. It was something about the two large blue eyes and sun-colored hair. No one was cold-hearted enough to resist that face. It had been really useful in getting away from debtors, actually. You don't need the money right now, do you? Look at that face. You can't take money away from me that I could be spending on him. The baby effect definitely came in handy, despite its inherent annoyances. Naru-chan's eyes had closed now and he'd begun to chew on her shirt absently in between soft snores. Tsunade grinned. He was just too cute, even when he was drooling all over her favorite green gambling coat. She gently laid him down and smoothed a few locks of blonde hair out of his eyes, frowning a bit at the odd emerging birthmark on his right cheek. If it continued to darken, it might obscure the whisker marks somewhat on that side, but it was kind of strange. She wondered if Minato had been related to some Inuzuka after all. The quiet mother and son moment was broken by the sound of the outside door slamming open and a cheerful greeting of, "Hey, Shizune-chan. What's for lunch?" ringing through the hall. Naruto's eyes immediately popped open and he snapped up like a jack in the box, hands making grabby motions to his mother to be picked up and carried to see the visitor, Ero Gigi. He begged, practically vibrating in happiness, and Tsunade sighed. It was nice that the two got along so well. Jiraiya was his godfather, after all, but she swore on the blood of her ancestors, if that influenced her son into being a pervert, she'd make sure he'd never be able to enjoy those tasteless books he wrote ever again. "Where's my little godson?" said pervert boomed, strolling into the room like he owned the place. Tsunade couldn't begrudge him when she saw Naruto's eyes light up even more, if that were at all possible. Jiraiya's brows furrowed in thought as he studied the seal on the toddler's stomach. The little tyke had been all too happy to ditch his shirt. You couldn't keep clothing on the kid to save your life unless you reminded him that big, strong ninja always wore their shirts for their mommies and didn't argue about eating their peas. For a moment, he was baffled. The seal seemed to be working absolutely perfectly and just how it had been designed to function. The only explanation he had for its constant visible state was if the kid were constantly molding chakra for some reason, which even his age aside, was pretty much impossible. He'd heard that some of the rarer blood limits dealing with elemental manipulation could cause a constant, small drain on the bearers, but Yondaime and Tsunade weren't carriers of any special traits that he was aware of aside from the usual flavors that ran through certain ninja family lines, advanced chakra control in Tsunade's case, and speed in Minato's. The kid was too young for the speed, even if it had developed into something on the level of a bloodline in his father. While his chakra flow was a little steadier than most kids his age, that could be explained by practice and the small natural aptitude males of the Shodime's line inherited. He was always using it for whatever it was doing, so it made sense that he'd be pretty good at it. Jiraiya doubted this was a sign of his mother's godlike control. Besides, control didn't explain what the chakra was doing, or why Kyuubi's essence was entirely undetectable in the kid. The fox was in there, he knew that, he'd seen it sealed with his own eyes, and the kid had the whiskers to prove it. Idly, he tried to brush what looked like a large smudge of dirt off of Naruto's cheek while he thought. The spot was kind of stubborn. He rubbed harder and Naruto began to wiggle in protest. "What the have you been playing in, Naru-chan?" The older man frowned, squinting at the stubborn stain. It almost looked like it was underneath the skin, and the shape was kind of weird. Tsunade was shocked speechless when she came in a few minutes later. "Jiraiya, are you drawing on my baby's face with a marker? That had better be non-toxic and washable." Her fist clenched and began to rise slightly. Wait, I can explain." He hastily backpedaled, babbling in his haste to avoid dismemberment and change the subject. In truth, he didn't know if the marker was washable, but he wrote himself notes on his hand with it all the time, so he was sure it was safe. Sometimes he didn't have paper on hand when great inspiration for a novel happened to strike. "I think I figured it out, and you're not going to believe it." You figured out what's wrong with Naruto's seal by drawing a weird floral design on his face. He could tell she didn't believe him because her face wasn't looking any less thunderous, and the heavy threat of violence still hung in the air around her. "I didn't draw it, I traced it, and it's not really that floral. I think they're more like vines and leaves. It's not clear enough to tell, yet." He hurried to explain. It didn't take her long to connect the darkening spot on Naru-chan's cheek with Jiraiya's stint at face painting. She leaned down and squinted at the design, though it was hard to get her son to cooperate and turn his head properly so she could see it in the light. He seemed to have given up on understanding adults some time ago, and decided they must be playing a new game that involved grabbing each other's faces. Tsunade finally agreed. "What the? You'd have to do a blood limit test to be sure, but from what I can tell, there's no other explanation." Jiraiya grinned. Shodime's Mokuton and Biju controlling abilities have turned into a properly inheritable Kekkei Genkei. The sort of one that acts at least somewhat subconsciously, and is always at work keeping the Kyuubi in line. Tsunade frowned and licked her finger to rub at the marker on her little boy's face in the kind of utterly gross gesture only mothers can get away with. That would explain why grandfather's techniques weren't copyable and hadn't presented themselves until now. It's not uncommon for something like this to go dormant for a generation or two while it transforms from a specific individual's genetic predilection into a family trait. Many of the clans started that way. "Yeah, well, I don't care about the specifics. This is great," Jiraiya exclaimed. "He's got a natural talent for dealing with the fox. It might not ever bother him at all." He might not even know he's got it. The natural drain might even act like chakra pool training. The kid's capacity will be huge before he ever even learns to use it. Tsunade didn't seem to be sharing his enthusiasm. Well, I guess, but it would probably make his Mokuten jutsu harder to use. The Kekkei Genkai would almost have to multitask to keep the fox's raw chakra from leaking out with the assimilated chakra. On top of that, what if he ever does use Kyuubi's power? His natural system is built almost as its antithesis. There's no telling what kind of effects that would have. Jiraiya frowned. Good point. Well, I can't say one way or the other. All I can tell you is that the seal is working exactly as it was designed to do, and that birthmark on his face looks an awful lot like plant life to me. I'd put money on it being the physical manifestation of a blood limit, and something's keeping Kyuubi's chakra from only getting into the kid's system after it's been completely changed over into his own chakra type. Signs point to Mokuten. Naruto seemed to have sensed the seriousness of the situation, and instead of squirming around and trying to grab their faces, he'd taken to chewing on a lock of Jiraiya's long white hair. His huge eyes stared up at them solemnly. I'll use the Kekkei Genkai testing jutsu, Tsunade stated, but I'm inclined to agree with you. I guess we'll just have to see what kind of effects this has on him in the long run. Want orange? Naruto complained as Jiraiya tried to deprive him of his current chew boy. Confusingly, but not surprisingly, Orange was also the name of the boy's favorite stuffed toy, a red frog with stylized black lines running over its plush body. He always wanted it when the adults around him had him upset, though he wasn't nearly as attached to it as Jiraiya heard some kids got to things like that. He'd bought it for the brat's birthday because it reminded him of Minato's favorite small summon, and he wanted the kid to have as many small bits of his father as he could manage to give him. The sage was surprised to see it was still in pretty good shape when they finally managed to find it under the bed's dust ruffle. He loves this thing, Tsunade muttered, attempting to knock some dust bunnies off of it before giving it over into Naruto's grabby hands. You and Orange go help Shizune in the kitchen. She commanded the little boy, lifting him up and tapping his in a playful swat to get him moving. The kid giggled like a lunatic as he took off on short, chubby legs, dragging Orange by large plush flipper, and yelling for his Zune. Were you ever that cute as a kid? He knew he shouldn't have said it as soon as the words left his mouth, but he'd never been very good at not saying the wrong things around her. Later that night, with Naruto safely tucked into bed with his ironically fluffy frog toy, the adults sat around the kitchen table with sake, in Jiraiya and Tsunade's case, and tea for Shizune. Well, the jutsu confirmed it. Tsunade said, taking a small sip from the saucer in front of her. She'd cut back a lot since she'd had her son, but she still really liked to indulge. Gambling just wasn't the same without sake, after all. So Shodime-sama's ability to perform Mokuten jutsu has become a Kekkei Genkai in Naru-chan. Shizune fiddled with her cup. I never would have expected. Well, we don't know exactly how it's going to manifest now that it's a blood limit rather than just a natural proclivity. It could be more or less powerful and controllable. It might even have entirely different effects. Odds are it's still plant-based, and it definitely affects demon chakra. That's about all we know for sure. Tsunade clarified. Jiraiya nodded in agreement. You can never tell with a new bloodline limit, that's why a lot of ninja families never try to develop their natural skills into more advanced genetic ones through breeding and stuff, like established clans with known bloodlines do. I see. Shizune looked thoughtful. This isn't going to be unhealthy for Naru-chan, is it? I know it hasn't hurt him so far, but if I understand what you told us about Yondaime-sama's seal, it's built to let him use the Nine Tails power to some extent. What if it reacts violently to his system? Tsunade nodded. She'd picked well in Shizune. The girl had real talent and the smarts to back it up. We already talked about that. There's really nothing we can do about it until we have more information. It may never come up. It could be that Naruto's body will simply not allow that part of the seal to activate. What if he's really hurt, or runs out of chakra? Well, then, that could be bad. If it comes to that, there's always a 5-point seal. It should block off Kyuubi's chakra completely, but it could also throw his system out of whack, so I don't want to try that unless it's necessary. He's managing the fox much better than I ever dreamed possible as he is, and I'm a big fan of, don't fix what isn't broken. Tsunade had to agree, she just hoped it didn't come back to bite them all in the later. She'd never forgive herself if Naruto died and they could have done something to prevent it. The terrible twos. Naru-chan, it's time to put on your shoes and get ready to go to the clinic with your Ka-san, and me. Shizune said. Her cute adopted nephew brother figure had recently had his second birthday and was already well into his terrible twos stage. Tsunade claimed if she heard the word no one more time, she was going to go completely insane and start setting fire to things. Shizune decided it was probably best if she took over the majority of the Naruto-related duties until he grew out of it a bit. Speaking of her mentor's currently least favorite word, no, Naru-chan said. His face set in an adorably obstinate little pout. He had a hold of Tauntaun's vest and seemed to be trying to hide behind the small pink pig. You know we do this every day, Naru-chan. Ka-san and I have to go to work so we can buy you things and pay for the house. Now, let's get your shoes on you. She leaned down and reached over Tauntaun, but Naruto sidled around the pig. Shizune frowned and turned to catch him, causing Tauntaun to turn, causing Naruto to giggle and dance sideways as well. This went on for several minutes until she finally lunged over the poor traumatized pet to the toddler up. He squirmed and protested, but she finally got him sat down on the couch and started to put his shoes on him. She was stopped from putting his left shoe on after his right one had been fastened, by his shirt hitting her in the face. Naru-chan, no, we don't take our clothes off except for baths and sleeping. Remember, if you do that, you'll have to wear the onesies again. No, he looked horrified. Bad. Zune. She scrunched the shirt back up and pulled it back over his head, helping him get his tiny arms through the holes. Don't call me bad, Naru-chan. You know you're not supposed to do that. Be a good boy and wear your clothes and let me put your shoes on you, and you can have a treat later. Orange. Yes, you can take orange with you, too. K. He stuck his thumb in his mouth and looked up at her with his angelic little face. Seeing him like that, it was hard to believe he'd been terrorizing the house all morning. She stood up and turned for a second to get his jacket when she felt something hit her in the back of the head. Ouch. She spun around to find no toddler on the couch and a tiny pair of shoes laying discarded on the floor, one of which had just been used as an impromptu projectile. The imp had good aim for a baby. She had to give him that. She sighed and followed the trail of discarded clothes to find her charge attempting to scale a tree naked but for his diaper in the backyard. This was going to be a long day. Tsunade cursed as they tried to make their way through the busy streets of Grass Country's capital city. This move had seemed like such a good idea at the time. Grass Country was plagued by easy to deal with things like allergies. It was mostly flat, relatively dry plains, so there wasn't a lot of rain or standing water, so sicknesses didn't really stick around or get carried by bugs too often. Add to that the fact that the boring terrain made injuries minimal, and it was a lazy medic's dream. She figured that the most a medic would have to deal with was the occasional mauling by a predator hiding in the thick vegetation to ambush random passers-by. Best of all, without any significant geographical features to bring in tourists, the whole country was dotted by world-famous casinos and other attractions in order to compensate. What she'd failed to take into her calculations when deciding on their current relocation, was the fact that everyone else thought it was a good idea to move here too, or at least visit really often. The place was packed. Idiot cart drivers were everywhere, cursing at each other and proving a danger to themselves and pedestrians. She saw more cart accident victims than she'd dealt with sunstroked people in the month they'd lived on the border of sand before Naruto'd been born. It was rule of the universe number 34 that people automatically lost 10 IQ points the second they got behind the reins of a cart, and some people just didn't have 10 IQ points to lose in the first place. After 5 minutes of waiting for a gap in traffic so they could cross over to the space they'd rented to set up a small clinic, Tsunade had finally had enough. Naru-chan, what mommy is about to do it very bad. When you're old enough to demolish things, don't try it, okay? The little boy nodded solemnly. Shizune quickly opened her mouth to protest, but it was too late. She'd already put a fissure in the road, upsetting 2 carts and causing a complete standstill in the traffic. There were loud curses and screams of outrage everywhere. Bad Ka-san. Yes, Naru-chan. Very bad Ka-san. Shizune thought about covering his ears so he wouldn't hear the expletives being hurled between his mother and the irate drivers around them, but figured it was probably way too late to keep him innocent of curse words. He did live with Tsunade, after all. What a cute little boy. Tamazawa-san exclaimed, spying Naruto playing with his stuffed frog on a blanket in the corner on the clinic. Tamazawa-san was a hypochondriac, Tsunade could tell. He'd come in complaining of malaria and he hadn't been to AIM in his life. Naruto-chan recently turned 2. She informed the older gentleman who knelt down beside the toddler and was reaching out to ruffle his hair. Ouch! The man exclaimed, hurriedly pulling his hand back. Be careful, she sighed, he bites. Great, now he'd probably be convinced he had tetanus or something. Shizune dug out a piece of poster board and a marker and plopped it down beside the blanket. It read, beware of baby. Good idea. Tsunade grinned. That's why you pay me the big bucks. Shizune deadpanned. What had started out as a perfectly average day took a surprising turn after that. Shizune and Tsunade looked up at the sound of the bell over their door tinkling a welcome to see an Anbu with long red hair tied back in a low ponytail and an otter mask stumble into the clinic, practically dragging her blood-covered partner. Tsunade's eyes widened. The man looked pretty bad, and even with the mask, the girl looked familiar. The only way that was possible was if they were residents of her old home village. Tsunade-sama, please help us. The girl gasped. Put him down in there. The medic barked, pointing to the examination room behind her. You're Konoha ninja, aren't you? Are you hurt anywhere? Where is the rest of your team? The woman laid her partner down as carefully as she could on the table. We're from Leaf, yeah. That's why I brought him here. The mission we were on went totally too. We were cut off from the rest of our team and trying to hide on the western edge of the city. Lucky for us, I heard people talking about you being in town after the huge cart wreck this morning. It's taken me this long to get us here. I'm not hurt, but we can't risk being seen. This is Black Ops, and Lion-kun is practically Hamburger. I couldn't move him very quickly without messing him up even more. Alright, get out of the way and let me take a look at him. Shizune, bring Naru-chan in here so we can keep an eye on him. I'm going to need your help with this one. She cast a glance at the tired and dirty-looking Anbu woman. Sit down before you fall down. Even if you're not hurt, you're obviously exhausted. The woman nodded. I'll be out in the other room. If you want, I can keep an eye on the kid for you, while you work. She sighed, hearing Naruto's protests. He obviously didn't want to pause in his playing to relocate in there. Well, you can try, but in your state, I doubt you're up to it. We'll just leave the door open in case you need help. Otter-san blinked. How hard could it be to watch a baby? He'd seemed to be playing pretty quietly when they came in. She went to relieve Tsunade's apprentice of Naruto's sitting duties, and got a sinking feeling when she saw the "Beware of baby" sign. Naruto looked up at her when she slid down the wall to sit beside him on the floor. He seemed to be attempting to completely cover a large red plush toy with as many plastic bandages as he could tear out of their packaging. He was doing a good job of it too. Well, Naruto-kun, are you playing med-nin and patching up your frog? Otter asked. She figured she might as well start up a conversation with the kid, as much as you could with a toddler. Maybe it would keep her awake. She hadn't slept in over 48 hours. They'd been on the run and she'd been worried her partner would die if she stopped giving him first aid. No, the little blonde boy said. He orange. Oh, okay, well, he was a toddler, who knew what went through kids' minds at that age. He looks kind of red to me. Orange red, he agreed, covering up one huge bulging eye of the toy with a large gauze pad. Well, not really. He's a pretty bright red. Why am I arguing with a 2-year-old about what color his plushie is? Orange, no orange. He looked distinctly suspicious now, and not a little upset. Whatever you say, kid. K. He went back to clumsily wrapping the frog in medical tape. Otter sighed and slid off her mask. It was technically a breach of protocol, but who was this little guy going to tell? Besides, the string was frayed and about to break, so she'd have to find something else to fasten it with soon, and it was hot under there. She'd pushed her long red bangs off her face. She needed to get them trimmed. Even her whirlpool forehead protector wasn't holding them back much anymore and her hair clip was proving useless. She leaned back and closed her eyes for a moment, only to startle them open again when she felt a weight on her lap. The kid had climbed up on her crossed legs and was reaching towards her face menacingly with a band-aid. Thanks, but I don't need one. She gently caught his hand. For a moment their eyes met. The kid had really rare colored eyes. She'd only even see that shade on one other person. Come to think of it, they had the same shade of hair too. She frowned and he mimicked her expression. Just to see if he'd keep it up, she threw him a cheeky grin, and her breath caught when he returned it. He looked just like, well, minus 25 years or so, but still. I must be more tired than I thought, kid. She groaned and lifted him off her lap. For a minute I thought you looked just like this jerk I used to be in love with. Ouch. She glared at the baby beside her who was now frogless. What the? Aren't babies supposed to be cute? Who do you think you are, throwing at me? Lady Bad. It was probably good things hadn't worked out between her and Minato. If they had, she might have found herself stuck with a little monster like this someday. It was a few more hours until Tsunade strolled out of the medical room and scooped up her little demon spawn. Your teammate is going to live, but it's a good thing you got him to us when you did. He wouldn't have made it all the way back to Leaf without medical help, and I'm guessing whatever mission you were on is off the books. The redhead nodded. We aren't sanctioned to seek outside aid, but you're still technically a Konoha shinobi, so. Tsunade nodded. Sensei wouldn't mind you getting our help. Even the council wouldn't be able to complain. I won't ask what you were doing way out here, I know you can't tell me. You'll have to stay with us overnight, though, because Lion-san isn't going anywhere until at least tomorrow night. Shizune and I are good, but we aren't that good. Otter sighed, but she'd expected something like that. Thanks for putting me up, Doc. No problem. Tsunade frowned down at the woman who had forgotten to put her mask back on. You're Uzumaki Kushina, aren't you? She swatted at Naruto's hand when he attempted to grab one of her ponytails to chew on. The Anbu looked stunned for a moment, before realizing her face wasn't covered. Oh, yeah, I'm Kushina. I saw you around a lot when I was growing up. You hung out with Minato's sensei, Jiraiya, a lot. Tsunade dodged a wildly flailing orange with expert ease. She felt kinda bad for the girl in front of her, almost like she'd stolen the life she was meant to have. She jiggled the sun that could have been the redheads on her hip, then chewed on her lip for a minute. Well, come on. Shizune's got a spare set of clothes in the back. You can shower and change back there, and then Naru-chan and I will take you too. Get something to eat. You look like you could use a good meal, and it's the least I can do. She mentally added. Really? Great. Can we get ramen? Tsunade blinked. She must really like ramen to want something like that after what she'd obviously just been through. Sure. It's not exactly the best thing for a kid as young as Naru-chan, but it won't hurt him to eat it once or twice. The woman levered herself up gracelessly and threw the mother and son a grin. Awesome. Thanks, Doc. She scampered out of the room in the direction Tsunade had indicated. It's a good thing that weirdo tomboy isn't your mommy, isn't it, Naru-chan? You'd probably grow up to be a mannerless, ramen-eating freak. Naruto cheered. What? No, I didn't mean you should try to do that. Ka-san, bad. Arg. It didn't take long for Kushina to wash up and change, and before Naruto and Tsunade could really get into it, they were on their way to the nearest ramen stand. The Sannin found herself unsurprised that even half dead with exhaustion and worry over her partner, the Kunoichi had made a mental note of the stand's location when they'd passed it on their way to get medical help. Tsunade grimaced as they slid under the curtains and grabbed stools at the counter. Naruto wouldn't have stood a chance with this girl as his mother. He'd have had ramen-eating genes coming at him from both directions. He'd probably have eaten instant ramen for breakfast if they'd been his parents, and knowing Minato, he'd probably have let it happen. Kushina noticed the look on her escort's face as she motioned for the cook to get her 2 bowls of miso noodles. Don't you like ramen, Doc? Huh. It's not my favorite food, but I like it well enough. Why do you ask? Oh, it's just that you made a face when we sat down. The Anbu watched the toddler in Tsunade's arms delicately sniff the air like a cat, his eyes getting bigger and shinier with each breath. Ah, the Sannin settled the kid a little more comfortably on her lap and pointed to the pork ramen on the menu when the chef looked in her direction. It's not that. It's just that ramen reminds me of Naruto's father, he used to eat it a lot. Geez, Kushina, way to stick your foot in your mouth. She berated herself. Everyone was always telling her she needed more tact. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to bring up a subject that's painful for you or something. Her comment was waved off. It's not that big of a deal. We weren't all that close, though he definitely had his good points, and at times I admired him quite a bit. In the end, he was a complete moron. I'm sorry. She had no idea how to respond to that. Yeah, me too. Kushina thought the look Tsunade was giving her was a little strange, but before she could comment on it, her food arrived. Alright. Itadakimasu. Want. Naruto exclaimed, madly trying to wiggle onto the counter and claw his way towards the kunoichi's ramen. Tsunade groaned. This was definitely a bad idea. She had a feeling she'd be paying for this one for years to come. Kushina grinned and playfully flicked her chopsticks at the kid, spattering him with broth. Maybe the little brat wasn't so bad after all. Nothing else very eventful happened during the rest of her stay with the Senju. Once Tsunade had shown her back to their little rental, she'd fallen asleep on the couch pretty much as soon as she'd seen it, and slept until her partner woke her up the next day. They were both eager to get back to Konoha and find out what happened to their other two teammates. Take care of yourselves, and don't push it on the way back. Tsunade lectured her patient. If you reopen those wounds and otters got to drag your back here, I'll let Naru-chan be the one to stitch you back up. She warned the poor man. Kushina winced. That was harsh. She adjusted the cloak on her shoulders and knelt down in front of the toddler standing beside his mother's apprentice and playfully tweaked his nose. You take care, Naru-chan. Eat lots of ramen and grow big and strong so you can come back to Konoha one day and join my division. You'll be a terror on the battlefield, I can tell. K. Naruto grinned and pulled a bandage off of Orange and stuck it over one of the eye holes on her mask before she could even register what he was doing. She chuckled. The kid had a nice set of reflexes for his age. She straightened up and peeled the plastic off her mask while Shizune scooped Naruto up off of the ground. Wave bye-bye to Otter-san, and Lion-san. One chubby fist opened and closed rapidly in their general direction and both hardened Anbu internally. Ah, Ed. He was just too cute. They returned the wave, and Kushina couldn't help but smile under her mask. She was definitely interested in seeing how that little guy turned out. She really hoped he ended up back in Konoha. Not as useful as it might seem. It wasn't until Naruto was 3.5 that they managed to find out for sure in what ways Kyuubi could still affect its host through the bloodline limit. As predicted, once he'd really gotten a handle on the whole, being ambulatory, thing, it had become impossible for someone who wasn't a highly trained ninja to keep up with him and prevent him from falling from one prospective death trap or another. Luckily, his guardians all were highly trained ninja, but even they had to sleep sometimes and no one can keep up that kind of vigilance 24/7. The kid seemed bent on sending himself to an early grave, or at the very least, scaring his mother and Shizune there. You couldn't keep him out of trees or off of roofs to save your life and they'd all quickly learn to immediately look up whenever he'd managed to pull a disappearing act. Unfortunately, looking up wasn't always a good idea, even if he was up there, because he also showed an early penchant for practical jokes and pranks, so you were likely to get a face full of muddy water. It was one such time, when he'd given all three of his frequent guardians the slip, that he discovered the horror that were bees. Huge fuzzy monstrous bees of stinging death. For the first time in his short life, Naruto learned the true meaning of fear. The first few stings hurt a bit and confused him. He hadn't done anything to the noisy bugs to cause them to bite him. Sure, he'd thought about trying to pet one since it was so oddly fluffy for a bug, but he hadn't had a chance to yet. He just wanted to get a closer look at their weird house. Before he knew what was happening, the strange structure had emptied itself of its inhabitants, and with a loud scream of terror the little boy jerked backwards to escape his small black and yellow assailants. This of course, caused him to go tumbling from the tree, and he'd really been quite high up. His cheek tingled oddly and he hit several branches he didn't remember being there on his way down, but they didn't do much to slow his fall. The forest floor rose up to meet him alarmingly quickly, the vast horde of devil bugs following him the entire way down. He lost consciousness as soon as he hit the ground. Tsunade and Jiraiya were immediately alerted to the fact that Naruto had managed to slip out of their care by his terrified yell. The slug Sanin had never felt something quite so horrible as the terrifying jolt that particular sound sent through her as her instincts as a mother and a medic immediately clamored together that something was very wrong. Neither adult even stopped to look at each other before taking off in the direction of the noise. It took them only seconds to reach the little boy, In fact, she almost managed to catch him before he hit the ground, as his fall seemed to have been slowed a little by some suspiciously conveniently swaying branches. A quick sweetened jutsu from Jiraiya managed to soak mother and son, but dissuade Naruto's crazed pursuers from further tormenting the boy. Tsunade quickly forced the mother and her down in favor of the medic. She knew Naruto wasn't allergic to bees. She'd done allergen tests on him as a matter of course, but multiple bee stings could be extremely dangerous, especially on smaller or weaker people like the elderly or children, and Naru-chan was already beginning to swell up with what seemed to her panicked mind as hundreds of angry red bumps. He'd also landed pretty awkwardly on his arm, and though it hadn't broken completely, she'd be willing to bet it was at least fractured. How is he? She could hear Jiraiya's voice, but she tuned him out, concentrating solely on completing a jutsu to pull out the chemicals from the bee's stingers. She had to be fast or his already closing airways would seal and he'd suffocate. Before she could apply her glowing hands to Naruto's body, his breathing suddenly became easier and tiny wisps of red chakra began to trail up from the deflating swellings covering his body. The wounds looked like they were burning away, and Naruto's arm no longer felt broken to hermetic senses, though more of the red chakra was coming from that area than the rest of him. What the? She murmured. Kyuubi. Jiraiya answered, crouching down to get a better look and be nearer if he needed to intervene. Before the process could quite finish, the red chakra abruptly cut off, and Naruto began to tremble and retch. He immediately developed a fever, and soon coughs racked his tiny body, flecking his lips with blood. To Tsunade's horrified medic's senses, it looked like Naruto's chakra system was attacking everywhere the Kyuubi's lingering essence had pooled, re-damaging tissues in its zeal to push out the malicious energy. It didn't take long for the large pockets of red chakra to be broken up, but the little bits splintered off when they shattered like shards of glass from a broken window, and they drifted through his system, chased by enthusiastic blue bits of his body's natural energy. This process was much slower and looked like it might take a while to complete, but Naruto's reaction had become less violent, and while he was still running a fever, the violent retching and coughing had stopped. What the was that? Jiraiya exclaimed. Shizune and I were right. Kyuubi's regenerative powers seemed to have been passed on to Naruto, and they kicked in when he was weakened enough for his defenses to fall. Once it had taken care of most of the damage though, he had a secondary reaction to the Biju's powers caused by his Kekkei Genkei attacking the fox's power in his system. His body seems to be treating it like an infection. She frowned and carefully cradled the boy against her chest, feeling some of her residual panic subsiding at the heat of his body through their soaked clothing and the familiar weight of him in her arms. She continued stroking his sweaten and sweat-soaked bangs away from his forehead. I imagine he'll be pretty sick for a few days at the rate things are currently going. She sighed and deactivated the monitoring jutsu she'd reflexively started as soon as she'd reached him. As long as there are no other complications with it, I think he'll make a full recovery, but we'll have to be careful and watch out for this in the future. Something similar will probably happen every time his body is weakened enough to have to draw on his chakra system, and next time it might be even worse than this. Jiraiya frowned and gnawed on his lower lip for a few minutes. Do you think we should go ahead and completely seal off the Kyuubi? The kid probably won't need the chakra boost from the assimilation. Not with you and Minato for parents. Tsunade stared down at the face of her baby, but then raised her eyes to meet her teammate's gaze. No, I think we should leave it. It's kind of like my Sozo Seisei Genesis rebirth technique. It's dangerous, but it should only kick in when he really needs it. It's never done anything about scraped knees or anything minor. Unless we discover any really bad side effects, I think it may be worth it to leave things as they are. She looked back down at Naruto as she started to shake a bit in delayed reaction to how close she'd just come to losing the most precious thing in her universe, the only thing that had given her back her reason to really live and not just exist. We came so close to losing him forever, Jiraiya. I know. He's so hard to keep track of. The other Sannin murmured. I don't know how he can be so loud 1 minute, then just poof, disappear, the next. Maybe I can invent some sort of tracking and communication seal, work it into jewelry or something. Tsunade nodded and gave him a tentative smile, one far gentler than he'd seen from her in years, since they'd been kids, in fact. Something like that would definitely be useful. Let's get him home now and dried off. He needs to be in bed. He's not nearly as bad off as he originally was, but he's still a very sick little boy, and I don't think there's anything Shizune and I can do to make this better. It's going to have to run its course. The toad sage nodded, sure. Do you need help getting up? She looked a little shaky with reactionary nerves. She started to automatically disagree, but then looked up at him with that weird smile again, and lifted the hand she wasn't using to cradle Naruto against her. He took it and pulled her up with ease. Together they started back to Tsunade and Shizune's most recent little rental. Jiraiya took off his coat and wrapped it around mother and son. Thanks. No problem, he easily replied, then frowned a bit and peered closer at Naruto's face. Your son's girly clan marking is nearly black now. What the? Tsunade tilted his face a bit to get a good look. Huh, well, I thought I saw the tree. Hey. There's nothing girly about my son. Jiraiya grinned and took off running. The only safe time to tease Tsunade of the monstrous strength was when she had her hands full with Naruto and couldn't hit you or chase you down. It didn't take them long to get Naruto back to the house, into clean, dry clothes, and bundled into bed. He was still running a high fever and hadn't yet woken up. Tsunade briefly activated her diagnostic jutsu again to see what was going on, and after determining that nothing was getting worse, she got up to get a bowl of cool water and a cloth from the bathroom. Jiraiya sat himself on the edge of the bed and smoothed the kid's hair away from his forehead, a frown creasing his face and pulling at the red lines that ran down either cheek. He's still really hot. I know. Tsunade answered, shoving the bowl at her former teammate. Make yourself useful. He easily caught the cloth she threw at him after taking the water, and began gently bathing the child's face and neck with it. Tsunade walked over to the trunk she stored her medical books in, and began looking to see if she could find any reference to treating chakra-induced infections. The room was silent for quite a while aside from the sounds of water dripping into the bowl and pages turning. Jiraiya caught himself running the damp cloth over the much darker mark on Naruto's cheek for the millionth time. You know, if the mark darkening means his bloodline has fully awakened, we're going to have to start training him. Tsunade slammed her book shut and tossed it back into the trunk, then flopped down in the chair she used when reading to Naruto at night. Absolutely not. He's not even 4 yet. He's just started to learn to read. Most kids don't start to train at 3, true, but most of them don't learn to read then either. It's not unprecedented. Hatake Kakashi started way early, and I hear the Uchiha's heir was trained from a really young age and has advanced really quickly. You're not helping your case any, Jiraiya. I don't want my kid to be some super ninja freak with no social skills. He's a kid. He's going to do kid things. I don't know if he'll really have a choice, Tsunade. He re-wet the cloth and folded it up, before placing it on the sleeping boy's forehead. If his Kekkei Genkai is active, then his chakra system must be advanced enough for it to function on some level. He's going to need to be trained or there's no telling what could happen. He hesitated to go further, but he felt it needed to be said. Besides, it's not exactly easy for him to connect with his peers. If you keep dragging him from place to place. As he gets older, he's going to have even less in common with normal village kids than he does now. It might help him to have a constant focus in his life. Tsunade got up and sat down on the bed opposite him, where she could see Naruto's face flushed with fever. If they didn't get a feel for his limits and how chakra use was going to affect his situation with the fox, things like this might happen more often and in less predictable situations. She bit her lip. Okay, we'll train him, but he's going to be a med nin when he grows up. Are you kidding me? Have you met your kid? He's on legs. There's no way you'll ever get him to sit through boring med nin lectures. It takes way too much bookwork. Aside from that, you'd give him a complex trying to get out of your shadow. The kid's like his father. He's going to kick and take names. Besides, I can tell already that he doesn't have your natural control. It's not bad, mind you, and likely to be better than most of us, men, but I'd wager it'll be nothing to write home about. He doesn't have the concentration. He's not even 4, of course he can't concentrate yet. She replied heatedly. Being a med nin is less dangerous than a stupid tank like Minato was. He'll need to avoid injury even more than most people if this is what happens to him when he gets seriously hurt. All the more reason to focus on teaching him to defend himself. We'll toughen him up properly before he ever sees combat. You will. I'll give him my special dodge training, and that'll be plenty. Jiraiya looked aghast. You'd put your own son through the torture you call dodge training. That's child abuse. I thought the idea was to prevent serious injury. It's not that bad. Shizune still flinches if you even mention the word dodge. Well, I'll go easy on him until he can take it, but he's learning to be a med nin, and that's that. A cleared throat from the doorway made them both stop arguing and turn in that direction. A frowning and worried-looking Shizune stood in the doorway, cradling a pig in a red vest and necklace. Not to step in here, but what happened to Naru-chan, and don't you think you ought to let him decide what he wants to be when he grows up? Tsunade looked indignant. Are you kidding? He's a little boy. All he's likely to want to do at the moment is learn how to smash things, blow things up, and look cool doing it. See, I win. Jiraiya cheered. No one smashes things like I do. Tsunade snarled, raising her fist to demonstrate. You still haven't told me what happened to Naru-chan. Shizune interjected, don't fight over his poor sick body. Tsunade and Jiraiya immediately halted their escalating argument and sat down looking like chastised children. Sorry, they muttered in chorus. Good, now, start at the beginning and tell me what happened. She snapped, setting Taunton on the floor and marching over to them. After they'd filled her in, all three sat silently, deep in thought. Well, I agree that it would probably be best to start his training. Shizune, ever the voice of reason, piped up, but until he's old enough to make an informed decision about his future based on facts, and his strengths and weaknesses rather than an arbitrary, coolness, factor, I say we teach him the basics and work on his physical skills. The stronger he is, the less likely he'll get hurt badly enough for his defenses to fall. Besides, giving him something constructive to do might make him easier to keep track of and less prone to getting himself into this kind of mess again. The other two reluctantly agreed. Interlude, Training Day. Naruto woke up before dawn and stared at his ceiling sleepily for a few minutes. Life was definitely getting more exciting for him now that he was grown up enough to learn how to be a ninja. He'd been back on his feet and good as new within a week of the bee incident, due mostly to the diligence of his two highly skilled medic nin relatives who hardly left his side the whole time. He was no worse off for his little adventure, except for a new unholy fear of bees and a greater respect for staying near Ka-san, Aro Gigi, and Zun when they were supposed to be watching him, and he'd become a little more attentive when they told him not to do something. His blood limit had definitely woken up and become more active. Plants started acting very strangely around the boy. To say their yard had a dandelion problem would be a monstrous understatement, and while most little boys had puppies follow them home, last week Naruto had been trailed by a tenacious vine of poison ivy. He hadn't asked if he could keep it. He seemed to have absolutely no conscious control over his new abilities, and it was annoying as well as embarrassing. On top of that, whenever Aro Gigi showed up, he teased him mercilessly about the mark on his cheek. It wasn't girly. No matter what the man said, the mark looked like stylized vines and leaves. Not like flowers. His Ka-san dutifully assured him this was so, and his Ka-san was always right. Unless there was money on the line, then you always guessed whatever was the opposite of what she said. Naruto had been training for almost a year now, and they'd settled into a decent routine relatively unchanged by their frequent moves from village to village. His guardians were sticking to the, let him make up his own mind about his future, decision, at least on the surface. None of them were above attempting to pound their specialties into his head when the others weren't looking and/or in creative or manipulative ways. They also weren't above trying to sway him to their way of thinking. Recently, Zun Nichan had launched a pro-medic nin campaign proclaiming that medics were the natural enemies of bees, but he'd seen Gigi's toads eat all sorts of bugs and never seen her eat even one, so he was pretty sure she was lying. No matter what they tried, it was pretty obvious that being a medic nin required a lot of stupid bookwork, and Naruto was having none of that, so he was leaning pretty heavily towards Jiraiya's side of the argument. Besides, Gigi offered to teach him a fire jutsu if he agreed to be a fighter, and everyone knew that setting things on fire was way cooler than healing burns. Naruto climbed out of bed and started his morning routine. No one else was up yet, but that was nothing new. Everyone else seemed to need more sleep than he did. As soon as he got his shoes on, he stood on tiptoe to open the door, and then slid out silently for his morning run through the village. He loved this time of the day. No one was up and everything was creepy and empty. It was pretty cool. So far Naruto didn't feel like he'd made much progress in his training. His Ka-san was really careful to monitor his chakra use. If it got low enough, Kyuubi's untransformed energy might leak through and make him sick, and she told him that if that happened he might not be able to leave his bed for weeks and he'd lose all the training time on top of being bored out of his skull. He still shuddered to think of all that they'd made him do while recovering from his first bout of Kyuubi sickness. He'd written all the characters he'd learned so far like 3 bajillion times, and they'd started him on math and history. He hated math and history. That was also when he'd been introduced to the chart. The chart was a diagram of the human body with labels in various colors, and Ka-san had told him in no uncertain terms that he'd better have all the things she'd highlighted in blue memorized by the time he was healed or she'd make him stay in bed even longer as punishment for slipping away from her and Aro Gigi. The chart had been used for creative punishments like that ever since. He finished his stretches and patted his tummy over the fox's seal indignantly before taking off in as brisk a jog as his little legs would allow. Stupid Kyuubi made everything harder. He'd been really surprised to learn he had a living thing in his stomach and that his dad had put it there. It seemed really kind of gross to him, and he didn't quite understand how it worked. He'd had bad nightmares for months of the demon bursting out and eating off people's faces after they'd told him the truth. He had a pretty gory imagination for a kid his age. Ka-san called him creative. He waved cheerfully to an old lady who was putting out her cat as he ran past her house. He loved the feel of really pushing himself to the limits, and he was starting to get into his first wind. Training was a million times better than watching. Zun read poison books or practicing making his letters. Sure, he hardly had time for tricks and pranks anymore, but he'd only really turned to them when he was bored anyway, so he didn't need them like he used to. The old woman waved back. She opened a bakery every morning and often saw him pass by on his daily stint. The child seemed to have inexhaustible energy. She wondered what kind of mischief he'd get into without his physical outlets. He was a sweet thing, but she was glad he had something constructive to do with his time. Swing by on your way back, dearie, and I'll give you a sweet bun. She called. She'd always firmly believed in rewarding hard work. Yosh. Thanks Ba-chan. He called over his shoulder. Well, he was sweet, but that lazy no-good mother of his should really teach him some manners. Poor Shizune-san, to have to put up with that about gambler for a mentor. She shut her door and went to start preparations for the day with a huff. Naruto continued on his circuit, now in even better spirits. The old bakery lady made awesome sweet buns. Not as good as ramen, but Ka-san wouldn't let him eat that more than once a day, anyway. If he somehow managed to wrangle ramen out of someone for a pre-breakfast snack, she'd definitely make him eat with Yuhei-san, the village babysitter, whose husband owned the clinic they were helping at, instead of grabbing the tasty noodle wife food with Aro Gigi later in the day, and then he'd have to put up with the other village kids. They were just plain strange. Training was way better than any dumb game the village children here played. They seemed to have a weird obsession currently with a game involving pointy metal bits and a rubber ball in a circle. They called it jacks, he called it stupid. The jacks weren't even sharp. You probably couldn't even kill someone in their sleep with one, and they certainly didn't explode. He reached the end of his route and turned around to head in the other direction, feeling the pleasant pulling and tingling in the muscles of his legs. As he ran he tried to make his mind stop wandering, so he could go over the list of plants in his head that Zun had given him to memorize. As soon as he could identify each one and tell her what parts were good and what parts were bad, which ones made people better and which ones made people sick, she'd promised to buy him a set of these cool new training straps that had just come out on the market which acted like weights. If you put chakra in them, they got heavier, and they helped you with your control too, because you had to always concentrate a little to make them work. They only got so heavy and you couldn't wear more than one set at a time, so they'd only help so much, but Naruto still thought they sounded really cool, and they came in orange. That occupied him for the rest of his run, interrupted briefly for the enjoyment of delicious bakery goodness. Once he made it home he ran in to get a quick shower, then grabbed real breakfast with his Zun. Growing up he'd had a bit of confusion over what he should call his Zun. Ka-san got really sad looking when she tried to explain how Shizune Nichan was related to them, so he mostly called her whatever he felt like, but he'd first called her Zun, since that had been his first attempt at her name and that's how he usually thought of her in his head. While he ate his cereal, Zune grilled him on her plant lessons. She wasn't supposed to teach him stuff when it wasn't actually her turn. It was some kind of agreement the adults had come up with to try and torment him into playing with the creepy other kids more, but none of them stuck to it, so he didn't mind much. He just had to be careful not to tattle on them to each other. Mommy always woke up late in the mornings, so she never knew that he usually spent the time before and during breakfast on Zune's extra lessons. They'd just put the books away and Shizune was cleaning up the kitchen while Naruto finished his milk when Tsunade finally wandered in looking like she was still half asleep. Naruto hopped up and put his glass in the sink, accepting the mug of Ka-san's morning coffee from Zune while he was there, and carefully carrying it over to the table. Jiraiya said coffee was like a henge jutsu that turned zombie Ka-san into normal, grumpy Ka-san. Naruto didn't know about that, but it did make her raise her head off of the table and make grabby hands in the direction of the cup, and after she'd consumed half of it, you could usually tell what she was trying to say if she talked to you. They never worried about Ka-san noticing them studying at the table, because Zune said she wouldn't know if Tauntaun tap danced on her head until she'd had at least one cup of coffee. After all of them had managed at least a little breakfast, the amount Tsunade consumed depended on how late she'd been up the night before, and if Shizune had let her go to the casino, it was time for chakra control lessons. He was only allowed to work on that for a couple of hours, and he was only supposed to do it with his Ka-san's supervision. This didn't stop him from sneaking out at night to keep at them on his own. He had to be really careful to stop practicing when his coils started to burn even a little. He'd be caught for sure if the Nine Tails made him sick again. If that happened, he'd probably have to memorize even more of the chart before he was allowed back into his normal routine. Alright, Naru-chan. To the wall. He'd originally been given a tree climbing exercise, but that had turned into wall climbing instead when the trees kept cheating. Hi, Ka-sensei. Tsunade rolled her eyes at the stupid nickname and blatant abuse of the language and watched him get to it. He was a determined little, she definitely had to give him that. She let him work on it until 10 o'clock, and then called a halt so he'd have time to re-energize before his lesson with Jiraiya in the afternoon. The old pervert wasn't around very often or for very long stretches, but he always insisted on training time when he was in town. Naruto sighed and reluctantly stopped charging at the wall. He hated it when chakra lessons were over because then, he had to practice his normal people lessons. This was stuff Zune insisted everyone, even future awesome ninja like him, had to know, like letters, numbers, and history. He hated them now just as much as he'd hated them when they'd first been introduced to him, so he usually turned them into stealth and evasion lessons instead. He was getting really good at evading, but Zune kept cheating and having Tauntaun help her find him. Tauntaun was a traitor and he wasn't ever again giving that pig scraps from his plate if she kept it up. She wasn't even going to get his peas. He somehow managed to slog his way through a chapter of his Konoha-centric history text. It was big, and he didn't always know all the words, but he got quizzed once a week, so he had to try and learn it. Luckily, they only made him do history once a week. It was almost as bad at Ka-san's medic lessons, which didn't even need a place in the rotation because he got in trouble enough that he ended up studying those really frequently as it was. He didn't know why they bothered to make him learn this, he always just forgot it later, but they were adults and you had to humor them sometimes. Ka-san liked to try and motivate him by telling him that she'd show him how her strength thing was done if he didn't complain about the schoolwork, but she'd gone and ruined it by telling him he'd never be able to do it as well as she could because he hadn't gotten her natural chakra control. She seemed to think there was some magic in having to sit down to pee that gave you more natural aptitude for that kind of thing. He totally didn't get it. He'd show her though. As soon as he could weasel the basics out of her, he'd try it over and over and over again until he could do it just as well as she could through practice and hard work. He didn't need any pansy shortcuts like she did. Bah, I'm so cool. I'll show her. He was allowed to put his books away before lunch, which was always a hurried affair. Hurry up and eat, Naru-chan. We've got to get over to the clinic by 1 o'clock. Shizune said. Tsunade rolled her eyes, give the kid time to digest. If there's an emergency they'll come get us. Naruto ducked under the table. It was time for a responsibility lecture with a side helping of, don't be a bad example for your son. Zune's eyes always sort of glowed demonically, and she seemed to grow about 10 feet when she laid into Ka-san about those things, and he couldn't make himself watch. It was just too horrible. Naru-chan, Tsunade eventually stuck her head under the table and winked at him. She was really brave to be able to withstand Zun's lectures like that. Crawl out from under there and go get Orange. It's time to go over to Yuhei-san's until the pervert comes to pick you up. Jiraiya wasn't allowed over to the house until well after lunch, so he could only mooch one free meal a day from them at the most. Naruto blanched. No. He hugged her legs. Don't make me to go. He made his eyes really big and felt a faint zinging sensation that he'd learned to ignore zing through his face and chest. They had this conversation every day that Jiraiya was in town, and he always won. He didn't know why this worked, but it definitely did. It was a good thing too, because he was supposed to be babysat while playing with Yuhei-san's twins at the park, and waiting for Gigi, but when they weren't playing jacks, they liked to pretend they were ponies, and he had no idea what that was about and wanted no part of it. Besides, he wasn't a baby anymore, so he definitely didn't need sat. He was sure his plushy frog, Orange, agreed. The little monsters tried to dress Orange up as a kunoichi sometimes, and he hated that. He'd told Naruto so. Tsunade predictably melted. It was completely useless to resist Naru-chan when he used the look. If she didn't know better, she'd think it was some kind of secondary Kekkei Genkei or some element of his original one, but people weren't Biju, so that was impossible. She sighed. All right, Naru-chan, go get Orange and your books and you can study at the clinic while you wait. I don't know why you don't like to play with the Yuhei girls. They're perfect little angels with decent manners, unlike some rude, grungy brats I could name. Huh. Yes. He cheered, ignoring her jibe, and ran off to get his stuff. Bookwork was bookwork, but he didn't mind more of it so much if it was a choice between that and death by dresses for him and Orange. Luckily for him, Jiraiya had caught on to their routine and he'd been chased out of the local bathhouses earlier than usual that day, so he was waiting for them when they finally arrived at the clinic. You ready for training, Gaki? Don't call me a Gaki, Arrow Gigi. He scowled, marching over to the much taller man and glaring up at him, his ragged toy frog clutched tightly in his fist. Jiraiya chuckled, I'll stop calling you a brat when you stop announcing that I'm a pervert in public. Tsunade rolled her eyes and strolled past them. They had a variation of this argument every day. Shizune and I will be home around the usual time, unless something comes up, again. Jiraiya had to train Naruto at their house because if he were allowed to pick the spot, he'd inevitably find somewhere with naked women within spying distance. Alright, we'll see you then. Come on, brat. He grabbed the back of Naruto's favorite bright blue jacket with the orange froggy hood and began towing the kid back the way he'd come. We'll see you when you get there. Bye, Zun-ni-chan. Bye, Ka-san. Try to do your share of the work today. A vein in Tsunade's temple throbbed painfully as he screamed that out at the top of his lungs for the whole street to hear. If his father weren't dead, I'd beat him senseless. There's no way he gets that mouth of his from me. Shizune sighed and preceded her mentor into the clinic. Sometimes she didn't know who the more childish one was. Gigi was only supposed to train him for a couple of hours, then turn him loose, but he never did. This was fine with Naruto, he'd probably just keep training anyway. What else was there to do? If he pulled more pranks, he'd just end up having to study more boring biology, and it just wasn't worth it when he wasn't bored. Orange watched him from the porch as he kicked the log. He loved the kicking the log game. Gigi had introduced it to him as a reward one day after he'd shown initiative by asking a billion questions after practice a week ago. He'd set it up near the target practice dummy especially just for Naruto. It was so great. Naruto wasn't sure what initiative was, but it must have something to do with asking why a lot and bugging the old man to tell him what the whole point of standing on one foot on one of the thin clothesline posts was during the endurance portion of their session. He'd also been initiative during the taijutsu portion that day, he guessed, because he'd asked a lot of questions behind the stupid taijutsu form he was having trouble getting. He couldn't seem to set his feet, just so, all the time, and it felt awkward. Gigi had been pretty sidetracked and kept brushing him off while he worked in his notebook and giggled a lot, and hadn't seemed to want to answer, but since he'd given Naruto such a great reward, he guessed it was some kind of test. When Gigi wasn't wherever they were currently living, Ka-san took over the afternoon sessions and made Zune go to work and heal people by herself. She called it her prerogative, because Zune was her apprentice. It didn't sound like much fun. Naruto was pretty happy he was her son instead, but he definitely wanted to get him one of those prerogatives so he could make someone else do his maths. Ka-san always made him do the normal things like laps and sit-ups and pull-ups, but when Gigi would usually have him work on taijutsu afterwards, she liked to throw things at him. She called this dodging practice because she said a good medic nin should never be wounded so they could always heal their teammates. The kids in the last village had a variation of this training, but both sides got to throw things and try to dodge, and they usually used instead of whatever random things they could quickly pile up and lob at you when you weren't ready for it, so it couldn't possibly be as much fun as Ka-san's version. When the girls finally got home from work, Shizune always oversaw his Senbon practice. He really liked throwing the needles at the target dummy. It had been especially made to look like a person's insides, and as he threw, Zune barked out different targets he was supposed to be trying to hit. It was kind of annoying because then he had to remember his anatomy lessons at the same time, and sometimes she'd forget what he'd been taught and hadn't, so she'd tell him to aim for the hippopotamus or something, and he had no idea where that was. Naruto was pretty thrilled with the overall arrangement. He got to spend one-on-one time with all of his family members, and even if it was really exhausting and painful sometimes, it was way better than running around on his own or playing with stupid dolls like some of his peers had to do because their parents wouldn't put up a log in their yards for them to kick. His greatest dream was to be a really cool ninja like the stories Aro Gigi told him about his dad, and if he had to learn a few wimpy medic jutsu to get him there, he was willing to make that sacrifice. He absolutely loved training for the most part. It was super fun, and he was really getting stronger. Someday he'd be strong enough to make a name for himself and become a hero. He'd protect everyone, and make Ka-san, and Zune, and Gigi really proud of him. Gigi said that when he was old enough he'd take him back to Konoha to become his apprentice, and that they'd be really surprised to see him, but they couldn't tell his mom about the plan until he was older, or she might not agree to it. He didn't know how he felt about that, because there, everyone would know his is the legendary Tsunade's son, and they wouldn't know about his dad or Kyuubi. He thought it might be kind of hard to deal with not letting his secrets out, and it would really him off if everyone in the whole village expected him to be a super med nin or something. It really made him mad when people did that. He was Naruto and his Ka-san was his Ka-san. They'd see how awesome he was though, and it wouldn't be an issue. He was sure of it. He grinned, put the leaf back on his head, and set it to spinning. It still had a habit of falling off when he started to gloat mentally, but he was sure he was getting better at it. He threw another handful of Senbon at the target dummy and whooped when they all hit it. Now he just had to fine-tune his aim so they all hit the specific targets and not just the dummy itself. "How's it going, kiddo?" Naruto glanced over his shoulder to where he'd heard his mom approaching. He didn't know why she wore such stupid shoes with high heels on them. She definitely wasn't as sneaky as Gigi when she was wearing them, and his shoes were those weird platform sandals with the name that reminded Naruto of cheese. Geto weren't very sneaky. Ready to quit for the night. It's good. He slipped his remaining Senbon back into the neat ninja pouch shaped like a frog that Ka-san had gotten him for a New Year's present and ducked his head a little when she insisted on ruffling his wild blonde hair. "Do I have to go inside now? I wanted to kick the log some more before bedtime. Aren't you getting sick of practicing, Chibi, and what's your obsession with that stupid log?" He looked up at his Ka-san while she spoke. "Why don't you ever want to go play with the other brats?" She frowned a bit as she caught sight of his knuckles from the variation on kick the log arrow Gigi had shown him today after seeing the neighbor's niece sunbathing in the next yard over. He called it punch the log. Gigi sucked at naming things. She immediately took his hands in hers to heal them for him. "No. I keep telling you, the other kids are weird. They all want to pretend they are mommies and daddies instead of ninja, and even when I can get them to play ninja, they don't want to run laps or throw Senbon or even play the original version of kick the log. It's madness. Sweetie, kicking a log isn't really much a game. What about hide and seek? You love hide and seek." He nodded enthusiastically, but then his expression fell a bit. "They don't let me play that one anymore because they all suck at hiding and seeking. They can't even find me by my chakra, and you and Zune and Gigi can always find me by my chakra." Besides, they all use smelly soaps that make them really easy to track. Tsunade frowned. I'm sorry, kid. I wish I could get you some other ninja brats to run around with, but your dad had a lot of enemies, and I'm worried they might notice the resemblance in most hidden villages. Maybe we can try Hidden Mr. Sand. They're on decent terms with Konoha right now. I know it's not very fair of us to keep moving only to these larger civilian villages. Naruto hated more than anything to see his Ka-san looking sad. It's okay, Ka-san. I really love training. I gotta keep it or I won't get strong. Being strong isn't the most important thing in the world, Naru-chan. His mother knelt down in front of him so she could look at him on his level. Ka-san was really tall. You know we'll love you and be proud of you no matter what you do or how strong you get, right? Naruto nodded solemnly. I know, but I really want to be a really strong ninja like great-granddad and Tsunade so I can protect you and Zune and Gigi someday. I'll even be able to tell people who Tsunade was, because I won't need protecting anymore. I'll be really cool, and no one will give us. Not even debt collectors. She winced a bit at that. Wouldn't you rather be a medic nin, Naru-chan? You can save people and take care of them, without worrying nearly as much about having to kill or getting hurt on missions. He closed his eyes as she threaded her fingers through his bangs and into the rest of his thick hair. It always felt awesome when she did that, so he didn't mind even if it made him seem a bit like a baby to so visibly enjoy it. I know, but I still want to be a protecting type ninja. I'll still learn the medic jutsu if you want, even though I really suck at it, but more than anything I want to be able to take care of myself and protect people like Tsunade did. Even dumb kids who only want to crawl around pretending they are puppies all day. Watch me, Ka-san. I'll be a hero and everyone will know me for me instead of you and Gigi. I'll be so cool that they won't even care about Kyuubi. Even if I have to train every day until I fall down, or learn to kill, or whatever. I promise, Ka-san, someday I'll be really great like Tsunade and Uncle Dan, and we won't even have to move around all the time anymore unless we want to, because no one will chase you out of race tracks even if you can't find me to pick horse names for you after you lose all of our money. He paused to take a breath. I'll make sure everyone knows they can still chase Gigi out of bathhouses though, cause he's a pervert. Tsunade felt a little ill as a sense of maternal pride warred with her instinctive terror of her son someday returning to Konoha and trying to become Hokage and summarily being stolen away from her like everyone else she'd ever loved who had the same dream. She had an instinctive hatred for the term hero, and it made her a little sick to think of her son wanting so badly to become one. She knew most little boys wanted to be like their fathers, but most little boys didn't have a father stupid enough to throw themselves in front of giant demon kings. It'll be okay, Ka-san. I know you worry about it, but I'm going to be even better than great-grandpa Senju and Tsunade so I won't die. It's a promise, and you said a man can't ever go back on his words. She sighed. This was all Jiraiya's fault, she could tell. He was always filling the kid's head with stories of Konoha and its great ninja, especially his father. Looking at her son's determined face and seeing how hard he'd been working, though, her fear subsided, just a little. I'll tell you what, brat. You promise to become as strong as you can, and let me put my Sozo Seisei Genesis Rebirth seal on you. And don't argue about wearing the monitoring seal the old pervert is working on no matter what the charm ends up looking like. And when you're old enough that the other kids your age will be graduating from the academy, I'll let your godfather take you back to visit Konoha and get your forehead protector. She didn't trust the Kyuubi to always take care of him, and sometimes it might be better to lose a few years off of his total lifespan than to be sick in the middle of a fight, so she was putting the Sozo Seisei seal on him whether he liked it or not. She poked him in the head, right where her seal's diamond shape would go, and her frown finally turned into a bit of a grin. You've got to prove to me that you can handle it though. I'm not letting you out of my sight until I know you can take care of yourself. That means mastering my super strength as far as you can and being able to take a hit from it. You've also got to be fast enough to dodge everything Shizune and I can throw at you, so you've got to get a lot faster and a lot stronger. There, that was a good way to hedge her bets. There was no way he'd be able to achieve the chakra control necessary for the strength, at least during combat. With the Kyuubi taking up an unmeasured portion of his chakra at all times, he'd never have the pinpoint precision it took, and his ability to concentrate quite frankly sucked. What she failed to take into account was how well he could commit something to reflexive memory if he tried it often enough so that he wouldn't have to concentrate on it, and he wasn't at all adverse to trying something as long and often as he had to in order to make it reflexive. Progress. If I had half your brat's energy, I really think I could take over the world. Jiraiya told Tsunade one day. They were currently staying in a sort of ninja retirement village on the edge of Wind Country. It was her compromise with Naruto. Old people liked to bet on things because there wasn't much else to do, and they absolutely loved playing cards. Tsunade called it Rule of the Universe number 27. She was pretty sure you got handed a deck and some bingo cards along with your gold watch no matter from what job it was you were retiring. This sort of place worked out great for all of them. Naruto got to bug Ninja for training tips even if they were too old to really show him how they were done. Shizune and her could make a lot of cash because old people were always sick, and the gambling was as good as it ever got even if the stakes were a little lower than what she preferred. The fact that there was no one here worth peeping on, so Jiraiya tended to visit not nearly as often was just cake, really. It was extremely good cake. Hey. This was one of his rare trips, but she hadn't seen him for a little over 3 months prior, so she could deal. They were currently sitting out on their porch at a small outdoor table and chair set. The breeze was pleasant and played with her long blonde ponytails. What would you do with the world that wouldn't have the entire female populace rising up in arms and relieving you of your within the day? Well, okay. You have a point, but it was hypothetical anyway. He quipped, barely fazed by the threat to his manhood anymore. He'd been known as the world's premier super pervert for 4 years now, ever since he finally put out his third Little Orange book. That reminds me, have you seen my newest title? After the flop of the first one, I almost gave up on the whole author thing, but wow, the Ika Ika series has really taken off. Tsunade raised an eyebrow and took another drink of her sake. There was nothing like good sake on a hot day. Jiraiya, if you still have your genitals, it's a pretty good bet I haven't picked up the latest piece of garbage you're trying to pass off as literature. Good point. He crossed his legs a bit self-consciously and grabbed for the bottle to refill his own drink. What the is Naruto doing anyway? I've never seen anything quite like that before. Oh, well, I was sick of him coming to me for new chakra control exercises every 3 seconds, so I told him to try combining the ones he already knew. So he decided to cover himself in leaves, while walking on a tree floating in a lake. It's good balance and agility training too, but well, the leaf thing is kind of accidental. He's still got no control over his bloodline abilities, and it's gotten worse since he started getting another mark on his shoulder to match the original one on his face. A bush reached out and grabbed him on his way through that brush there on the edge of the lake, so he must have decided he might as well use the leaves too. Shizune and I have tried everything we can think of to help him out with his botanical problems, but nothing works. Well, he's just shy of 6. Maybe it's a maturity thing. The fact that he's getting another mark could mean that the Kekkei Genkai has stages like the Sharingan, and he's just got to level it up or something. Level it up. My son isn't a video game. Yeah, well, you know what I mean. Jiraiya frowned and fiddled with the bit of metal in his hands. He'd been tinkering with this seal since Naruto's bee incident, but he just couldn't get it to do quite what he had in mind. If it keeps going much farther than this, I might have to scrape up enough to hire a mission out of Konoha, and Anbu are expensive, so if you've got any suggestions that don't require feeding him coins, please let me know. You mean hiring Tenzo to come train the brat? Sensei's not likely to go along with that, not even for you. I know he's the only other Mokuden user currently living after what that Orochimaru did to him, but Anbu don't grow on trees, and he's really been moving up in rank lately. With Danzo around, they need him there. He glanced up through his spiky bangs at his frowning teammate. You may have to send him to the village if you aren't willing to move back there, yourself. Her grimace turned feral and she slammed a fist down on the table, cracking it but not breaking it in half. Shizune only bought reinforced furniture for her mentor if she could possibly help it, and it was much cheaper and easier to find in a town like this dominated by ninja, retired or not. I'm not sending him back there by himself. He's still a baby and that place is cursed and a death trap. Hey, I was just saying. Besides, you know I'm right. Tenzo could be the only one that might be able to help him. Well, we'll just have to hope it doesn't come to that. She growled, forcing herself to calm down and unclench her teeth before she gave herself a migraine. No point in worrying about it right now. If he can hold off on it for a few more years, I really think he'll have met your requirements by the time he's 10 or 11. He only got hit twice in dodge training today, and you looked like you weren't holding back much on speed. When he's ready, I can have Sensei and the Mokuden kid look at him when I take him back to get his headband. Che, the dodging's impressive, but I can't believe he's made so much progress on that strength technique. She fumed. You should know how determined he can be when he really wants something. Jiraiya pointed out. Yeah, well, how could I have known that it was possible to achieve perfect control of just one technique when your natural level is almost completely average? She growled. It shouldn't be possible to learn something like that through nothing but repetition and sheer force of will. Well, you didn't tell him it wasn't possible, so of course he could do it. Jiraiya grinned. He's going to break all sorts of rules of possibility, if for no other reason than he's too stupid to think it through and realize it's impossible before he starts, and he won't give up once he begins trying something until he can do it flawlessly. He should have expected her fist to the top of his head, but somehow, he never saw it coming. Baka. My son is not stupid. He's just got too much energy to sit still and learn things. It's the Kyuubi's fault for jacking his chakra levels so high. I've assigned him 2 hours at the shogi parlor every day as part of his training, so hopefully that'll teach him patience and a little strategy. If the old guys they're off too much by running around, they won't give him pointers or show him jutsu anymore. It's got nothing to do with the fact that people bet on shogi, and he absolutely can't lose games of chance, is it? Jiraiya grinned, as he picked himself up off the ground and regained his now kind of wobbly seat. You know that kid will never be good at planning and conventional tactics. He's too much a natural genius at improvisation and unpredictable creative strategy in the middle of battle to ever slow himself down and apply people that aren't Naruto logic to a situation. Tsunade sighed. I know. He's absolutely hopeless at long-term analysis. He can't think, what would I do in this situation, to predict other people's actions because no one else would ever think of half that he does. And more than half the time his answer to the question would be, I'd just wing it, anyway. I'd say he'd have to grow out of that if he wants to be Hokage someday, but it always seems to work out for him, so it's hard to criticize. Tsunade groaned and buried her head in her arms. I know. The kid can't lose if probability is involved. It's not fair. Impulsively she stood up, knocking her chair over in the process and pointed accusingly at Naruto. Hey brat. Stop stealing all of my luck, you little. The yell broke Naruto's concentration and all his leaves went fluttering into the lake while he wobbled frantically on the now unstable log before catching his balance. Hey, you old hag. You almost made me fall in. He screamed back. Jiraiya chuckled and went back to fiddling with his new seal, ignoring Tsunade's grumblings about ungrateful little brats with no respect for their mother's suffering. I wouldn't complain too much, if I were you, he said, turning serious. I'm pretty sure he'd be dead by now if he had your luck instead of Minato's, with some of the trouble he gets himself into and the way he pushes himself training with new jutsu and chakra techniques without anyone watching him. Tsunade sighed, but had to agree. When it came to getting stronger, the kid just loved it and refused to fail at anything he set his mind to. She'd done everything she could think of to curtail his chakra use without supervision, but he was the most headstrong and independent little ever. He had to get it from his father. That jerk had a lot to answer for when she met up with him again in the afterlife. No way did he get his stubbornness and willingness to take chances from her side of the family. So, want to play another hand of cards? Double or nothing. Yeah, now you're talking, she eagerly agreed. Naruto glared down at the floating leaves that he'd been dutifully holding with his chakra while balancing on the log which he was keeping stable in the lake with a great deal of concentration. He was getting kind of frustrated. He seemed to have reached a plateau in his training and it was really him off. He was pretty sure if he could just etch out another little bit of control, he'd be able to perform a bunshin, and from there, it was just another small step to his Ka-san's freakish strength. Technically, for him, the strength in bunshin should be about the same difficulty because freakish strength required a lot more chakra. Every night he stayed out late hitting boulders, blocks, and logs until they shattered, but it was still taking 2 or 3 hits instead of just 1, and he frequently had to heal his arm afterwards. He'd gotten to the point where he didn't have to think about how to mold and release the chakra anymore when it used to take him ages to prepare himself for a single attempt. He was even pretty sure he could use this much of it in battle since it was coming so naturally to him, but it wasn't nearly as good as Ka-san's, and when he messed up and hurt himself, well, that wouldn't be good in a fight. He'd narrowed down the possible problems to one or two things. He was pretty sure he was building up enough chakra in preparation, or at least as much as he was capable of at his size and age. He could feel the pressure on his chakra coils whenever he did it, and he knew if anything, he'd been able to gather more of it than he used to do, so the solution wasn't to use more chakra. He was really glad to have ticked that one off the list because his aunt was always on his case that all problems can't be solved by applying more chakra to them. She'd had a field day with that rant when he'd originally begun having so much trouble with Bunshin. No, he had to be either not narrowing and condensing the point down tiny enough, or not releasing it at the right moment. He knew he wasn't releasing it way too soon because his arm never exploded off of his body, but he thought there might be an interval between way too soon and right on time. It was also possible he was letting it go too late. He had tried all sorts of combinations, but the answer still eluded him. Either way, it was a chakra control problem because he just couldn't make it do exactly what he wanted it to, but he was a lot closer with that one than the chakra scalpel jutsu. That one required a small, precise, and sustained amount of chakra, and he kind of thought it might always be beyond him. He figured that since he'd never have the natural control his mom and aunt had, he'd just have to treat each jutsu like another chakra exercise as well as a technique. He may not be able to intuitively know just exactly the right amount to use, but if he tried it often enough, he was sure to stumble on it eventually. He did have excellent senses, and he knew when he did it correctly because it just felt like it was right. It was an uphill struggle because while most people just had a decent-sized puddle to feed through their chakra coils, he had a lake. When the valves were open, the pressure was higher. It made it much harder to regulate. It was like trying to get exactly a liter of water from the floodgates on a dam versus the taps on a faucet. To further complicate things, his proverbial faucet was always leaking power to his seal to keep Kyuubi back, and therefore, throwing off the flow. He plopped himself down on the log, and being sure to keep his chakra flowing around it and down to the bottom of the lake so it stayed stable, he carefully took off his sandals and threw them on the shore so he could dangle his feet in the water without soaking his footwear. Idly he swished his legs back and forth, tracking the underwater movements he was causing by the way the submerged leaves moved. He tried to get them moving farther away or to go in specific directions by hitting the water harder, and using more forceful movements, but that just made them swirl around a lot. They hardly ever even hit the log he was sitting on as the currents pushed ahead of them and bounced off of the wood before they got there, repelling them back. He found that if he got closer to them before plunging his foot in, it was a little easier to get them to do what he wanted because there was less room for the water to spread out and make the leaf do other weird things. Also, they obeyed a bit better if he approached them slowly and sped up gradually to disturb the water as little as possible outside of the main movement. Wait a minute. Eagerly he jumped off of the log and sprang the distance between it and the shore, sprinting for the old wall behind their house that was his favorite target for super punching practice. Instead of focusing the chakra just generally, in his hand, he'd try to put it on the very edge, right on the knuckles. If he was lucky, maybe that would even protect him a bit from the force of the hit. That must be how Ka-san does it. She puts the chakra point at exactly the right distance from her knuckles so that there's enough room for a slight buffer around her hand, but releases it as close as possible so all of the force is directed into the target except for that tiny protective bit. She builds it up slowly and then bam, at the right moment, smash. Jiraiya watched him run past as he raked in his winnings while Tsunade dealt the next hand of cards. I think you're in trouble. He's got that sudden epiphany look on his face his father used to get when he finally figured out the trick to something like the Rasengan. Tsunade growled, well, he might figure out the punching part, but the kicks are much harder because chakra is so much more difficult to mold in the feet. Bet you 100 Ryo he'll have the whole thing mastered and combat ready within 2 years. Ha. Deal. There's no way even my kid is that brilliant. Maybe if he only had that to focus on, but I bet you didn't know how hard Shizun's working him on Senbon accuracy. He bet me 50 Ryo last week that he'd be so good at it in a year that he'll be able to safely throw them during dodging practice and hit any target with at least 90 accuracy. And he's got to learn a basic medical jutsu and memorize the biology behind it every other month until he's 7 as punishment for purposefully giving me the wrong numbers on last week's lottery ticket and selling the right ones to everyone else in town. What's with the sudden interest in weapons? He can hardly throw a kunai or shuriken to save his life, does he even own any? I know you haven't been teaching them, and while he's never really complained about Senbon practice, it's never been his favorite. Hey, well, he saw Shizune temporarily disable a pervert's ahem equipment the other day when they caught him trying to peep in the changing rooms at the department store where she had to take him to replace his jacket after the cake incident. Jiraiya swallowed nervously, crossed his legs again, and made a mental note not to mess with Tsunade's apprentice, cake incident. You don't want to know. Think of the beach ball debacle, only about 3 times worse and involving more old men in golf shirts. Wow. Yeah. We're not allowed back at the dog park anymore. Poor Taunton, she really liked the dog park here. Into the deep. The day was hot and the water was cold, and best of all, there wasn't a plant within petting distance. This was definitely Naruto's favorite place of everywhere they had lived so far. They'd come here right after his 8th birthday and were still here several months later. He grinned, constantly adjusting his chakra output to keep him on top of the madly rolling surf, then leapt up in a nimble flipping maneuver when the waves pulled him too close to the rocky shore. This was heaven. Why hadn't they moved to the seaside much sooner? His smile threatened to split his face as he plopped himself down on one of the large black rocks that jutted out into the ocean on his favorite training beach. Not so far off in the distance he could hear other children laughing and playing over the sound of the constantly moving surf. He liked to sit and watch the families when he ran out of usable chakra or just needed a break. Some of the kids had pets to throw frisbees to, or siblings to dunk in the water, and almost all of them had fathers. He sighed and shook his head to clear it of those kinds of thoughts as well as to shed some of the moisture that had gathered in his hair from his romp. It didn't help the later problem much. His blonde mop stayed pretty much soaked from the ocean spray, but it did get his mind off of the former and he eagerly stood back up and stretched, ready to have another go on chakra surfing. This was such a cool technique, and he thought if he worked on it enough, he might be able to change it up so it worked on other unstable surfaces like snow or sand. How cool would that be? Before he could hop back onto the water and make a mad dash for the deeps, he had to be careful to time the jumps correctly and get out of the way fast or he'd be smashed against the rocks. He heard a sudden shout and the rumbling of falling stones. His head shot up and his eyes darted in the direction of the noise, over towards the formerly laughing family that had been playing in the sand. The dog was missing and so was the littlest kid, a daughter who'd been wearing a bright yellow sundress. Without thinking about it further, he took off towards the remaining 2 adults and older sibling. When he got closer, he saw that the mother had tears running down her face and a hand over her mouth. The father was leaning into a small crevice barely larger than Naruto's shoulders. "Nina!" the man yelled, but there was no answer. "What happened?" Naruto asked the slightly older boy who was standing beside his mother and looking kind of guilty and very worried. "My sister. I threw the ball for Muffy, that's our dog, and it accidentally went into the rocks there. Muffy went in after it, and when he didn't come out right away, Nina followed him in, and then the entrance collapsed a little, and now she won't answer us." Naruto scampered forward over the sand and rocks to look at the little cave beside the frantic father. He bit his lip in thought. Ka-san had warned him that this area was riddled with tunnels and caverns made by the same volcanoes that had left the huge chunks of rocks lying all around, and volcano rock was pretty full of holes to begin with, even without the ocean working on it for years. She'd told him to be careful if he practiced making craters with his newly mastered freakish strength, because you could never tell if you were on top of something like that, and you could open up a hole that went much farther down than you expected. It looked to him like Nina and Muffy had found one of those little caves and were probably trapped now. "What are we going to do?" "Oh, Nina," the woman behind them wailed and the father cringed, looking helpless. The man began to twist the large ring on his finger, deep in thought. "Calm down, darling. I'm sure she just slipped when the rocks here fell and now she'd too scared to come out. We'll get some men here to move the rocks and have her out in minutes. That will take too long. Don't worry, I'll take care of it," Naruto quipped. "I'll go in after her and bring her back. I think I'm small enough to squeeze in." One of you can just run to town and find my Ka-san in case we need her to move these rocks. She's a really strong ninja and a medic." The woman began wailing at the prospect of her daughter needing medical attention. "I appreciate the offer, but I don't think it's safe for you to go down there, you could end up trapped too. You stay up here, and I'll go to town for help." "Where can I find your Ka-san?" "She's a tall woman with blonde hair and Gamble written on the back of her coat. My Ni-chan will be with her with a little pig. Ni-chan has dark hair and a black yukata. If they aren't at the hospital, they'll be at the casino. You'd better check there first, since it's closer. Ka-san's name is Tsunade." "Tsunade. The legendary medic nin," he gasped, hurriedly standing up to go find her. "Yeah, she'll definitely be able to help." He nodded and took off towards the town as fast as he could while his son attempted to comfort his mother. Naruto looked back at the hole and bit his lip again. The man was probably right, he shouldn't go down, but the little girl could be hurt or something, and it must be scary to be trapped down in a hole. He was sure he'd be okay with his chakra. If he needed to, he could just walk up the wall or something to get out. Thinking things through before acting would never be his strong point. Without further ado, he used his own strength to toss aside the main stone blocking the entrance and then began to squeeze himself through what was left of the opening. "Hey, Dad said you should wait for help from town." The other boy gasped, his hands twisting nervously in his silk beach robe. "Don't worry," Naruto called, "I'll be fine. I'm practically a ninja already, too." It was a tight squeeze between the rocks for what seemed like ages. It took him quite a while to worm through, and he scraped his knees and elbows several times before the tunnel suddenly opened up into an area wide enough that he could comfortably stand up, then seemed to widen even more up ahead as it sloped down a bit into uncertain blackness. "Nina," he called, coughing a little on rock dust in the air and looking around. It was really dark in there. He wished he'd thought to bring a flashlight or something, but he hadn't packed anything but weapons and a few bottles of water into his ninja pouch that morning. The light from the opening was getting smaller and further away as he walked on. Nina wasn't answering, but he thought he heard a dog whimpering somewhere up ahead. The noise was echoing oddly, so he couldn't be sure. There was a sudden rumbling and before he could even scream, the ground fell out from under him, sending him tumbling into a quickly widening hole he hadn't seen in the floor several feet away. Tsunade tuned Shizune out as she put another coin into the machine in front of her and pulled the handle. Who cared if she blew a few ryo on the slots? It wasn't like their work wasn't in high demand. She was the best medic nin in all of the 5 countries. They weren't in debt like they'd been before she'd gotten over her phobia of blood. She could always make up the cash she lost by saving some rich wife from a splinter or something. Nobles would pay the stupidest prices for fixing the lamest things, and they wanted only the best. This place was teeming with rich people on vacation, some in disguise, and some not, but half of them hypochondriacs. The little wheels in the machine turned and clanked and Shizune lectured on and on. "Cherry, cherry, cherry, oh, something horrible must have happened." The last wheel stopped on Cherry too. Lights and buzzers went off, and coins began clinking into the tray in front of her. Shizune stopped and stared at her mentor, a look of horror on her face. "You won." That was never ever a good sign. "Where's Naru-chan?" Just then, a man ran up to them, panting and looking worried. "Are you Tsunade, the medic nin? Your son said you could help me. My daughter is lost in some rocks on the beach." Tsunade stopped collecting her coins and immediately jumped up from her stool. "Where at? Show us." Together the 3, plus 1 pig, ran towards the shoreline. Naruto groaned and struggled to open his eyes. There was an odd pressure on his left side and everything hurt like he'd just got done with a dodging practice gone horribly wrong. He had no idea where he was or what had happened, and even when he finally managed to pry his eyelids up, it didn't help. Wherever he was, it was pitch black in there. He could smell rock dust and hear water dripping somewhere, but couldn't make out anything else about his surroundings or remember quite how he'd gotten there. His arm and ribs hurt so badly he could hardly think, and he could feel the Kyuubi trying to get at whatever was wrong in order to heal him. If that happened, he'd be in trouble because he couldn't do much to get himself out of this mess, let alone a scared little girl, if he was seizing and coughing up blood. He had to figure out where he was and try to stop it. The ground beneath him seemed to be made of uneven, porous rock, and there were smaller stones digging into his back. He felt along the object pinning him, and judging by the texture and the way it curved around and to the side, he realized it had to be a larger version of the stones he was laying on. Similar boulders seemed to be wedged all around him, and by the feel of his headache, one of them had become acquainted with his skull at some point. He couldn't hold back a groan of pain and a little whimper as he tried to wiggle experimentally to see how stuck he was. Nothing budged. Memories of what had happened began to trickle through, and he knew he had to free himself before too much of the fox's chakra entered his system. He was already beginning to feel a little feverish, the first sign of chakra sickness. It was hard to concentrate, but he managed to summon up enough energy into his coils to use some approximation of his freakish strength and move the boulder holding him down. Kyuubi's power must have already mixed enough with his system to cause some problems, because instead of just pushing the rock aside, it exploded on impact, splattering him with sharp splinters of stone, and his tenketsu burned like nothing he'd ever felt before. He nearly screamed with the pain of it. Oh, not good. Not good, I want Ka-san. He forced himself to calm down and take a few breaths. Panicking wasn't going to help anything. He'd never before tried to use his chakra much when Kyuubi's energy was leaking into his system, and he made a mental note not to try it again if he could help it, but he managed to fight down the lasting ache to clear his thoughts enough to function again. He gripped his wounded shoulder and was disconcerted when his hand came away wet and sticky with blood. He forced himself into some semblance of a meditative pose, gasping through the pain as he struggled into a sitting position. He slumped against one of the larger rocks, and pulled his legs up. This was so not good. His stomach tingled more urgently, where the seal sat, and the mark on his cheek began to burn. He frantically sent as much chakra as he could towards the site to try and keep the filter intact. If he could only strengthen it enough to hold for a few minutes, there. Quickly, while he was able to use his chakra for other things, he tried to summon up one of the few healing jutsu he knew, a basic, heal light wounds sort of thing, but it was the best he could manage at the moment. His left arm didn't want to work right to form the seals, and it took him 4 tries with even the small amount of Kyuubi's power in his system throwing off his control. He usually had about a 75% success rate with basic healing jutsu, but he'd never had to try it under these kinds of conditions before. He silently promised himself that he wouldn't argue with Ka-san and Shizune about augmenting his training with medic nin skills anymore, if he managed to survive this. He finally succeeded in activating the jutsu. A light green glow sputtered around his right hand, and he immediately held it over the large, bleeding gash on his shoulder and ran it down over his aching ribs. As he worked, it got easier to keep back the fox's power, and the jutsu flowed more smoothly, but there was only so much he could do. By the eerie green light of his glowing hand, he could see that the rock that had fallen on him had been sharp and heavy enough to make several small gashes along with the larger slash he'd been healing, and he was bruised up really good, but he didn't think his shoulder was dislocated. It evidently hadn't damaged anything too important because the bleeding was sluggish and he could still move his fingers. By the feel of his head, he'd probably had a concussion at one point, but he guessed that's where Kyuubi's chakra had been heading because he wasn't dizzy enough to be newly concussed. He took a few more deep, painful breaths and tried to remember what Shizune and Ka-san had told him to do if he were ever hurt by himself somewhere. Emergency medical care. Check. Assess the surroundings. Check. Figure out as much as he could about the rest of the situation. Well, he guessed that was next. He killed the power to the healing jutsu. And started up the diagnostic one he'd just learned last month. He didn't like what it told him, but it could have been much worse. It looked like 2 of his ribs were cracked, but the bones in his arm were whole and he'd been right about his head. It wasn't a full-blown concussion anymore. All in all, he needed more medical attention than he could give himself, but he didn't need it right away. He had water in his pouch, not much but enough to last him a few days if he rationed it. Now that he knew where he was, what was wrong with him, and had determined how long he could stay that way, he needed to figure out how to get out. He knew he couldn't afford to burn the chakra it would take to keep a light going indefinitely, but if he fell down again or something, having chakra left wouldn't do him much good. Besides, he had to find the little girl, and see if she was hurt, and then see if he could get them out of there. This was proving to be a much tougher task than he'd thought when he climbed into that hole. Hopefully his Ka-san was on the way. He didn't want to admit it, even to himself, but he was only 8, and he was scared and hurt and wanted a hug. Okay, Calm down, calm down. He closed his eyes and concentrated. He'd been trying to learn the chakra scalpel for ages, but the control at that amount of small required output was still beyond him. When he'd begun learning it, it had been a sort of compromise between himself and his Ka-san. He'd wanted a cool offensive jutsu, and she'd wanted him to learn how to ease inflammation. They'd settled on the chakra scalpel because it could be both a medical jutsu and used offensively. Unfortunately, his scalpel was more like a chakra butter knife. It worked really well in this situation though, because instead of coating his fingers in a sharp, thin layer of energy, it lit up his hand in glowing blue waves. He levered himself upright and staggered along the way a bit until he could see the ceiling of the area he'd tumbled in with the jutsu's light. It looked like the floor of the smaller cave up above had given way, sending him down in a shower of rocks into this cavern, which stretched on in an undeterminable distance in front of him. Studying what he could see of the area above, he thought it ended in this hole. He hadn't seen any other offshoots when he'd been up there, and the walls rose on three sides of the chasm. That meant Nina and Muffy had to be down here with him somewhere. What remained of the ledge was about 20 feet up at a sharp incline, and bits of sand and small stones fell down between the rocks piled up, making a sort of really steep ramp. He figured he must have at least partially rolled down that, because if he'd fallen from that height with the boulders littering the floor, he doubted he'd have survived. If he weren't hurt, he thought he'd have been able to climb back to the main tunnel easily, and he could probably still make it up there if he absolutely had to. But he hadn't found the little girl yet, so he couldn't just abandon her here. He chewed on his bottom lip, a habit he'd picked up from Aro Gigi, and looked from the hole in the ceiling towards the forbidding darkness of the tunnel in front of him. He didn't want to go, but Nina couldn't be much older than him, if she was even his age yet, and she wasn't a ninja, so she was bound to be even more scared. He'd told her dad he would go get her, and he never went back on his words. There was nothing for it. He gasped in pain, even breathing hurt with the damage to his ribcage, but began to stagger down the tunnel, his chakra lighting up the pathway in front of him. He used as little as he could, but it still showed him the uneven path a good 5 feet ahead. Hopefully it would be good enough to keep him from falling into another pit. He wished he'd thought of it sooner, it might have prevented this mess. It wasn't too long before Shizune and Tsunade reached the beach where Nina's mother and brother were waiting anxiously. The slug Sanin felt her stomach drop when she didn't spot Naruto with them. Knowing her son's penchant for getting into horrible situations, there was little doubt he'd decided to play hero. She had hypothesized that the gene for stupidly risking your neck for other people must be hardwired into the particular blue of his eyes, because his father'd had the same eyes and the same problem, that man. It had taken about 10 minutes for them to arrive on the scene, traveling at the fastest speed their guide could run, and Tsunade mentally cursed all non-shinobi as she quickly strolled forwards to assess the situation. A small opening in the rocks was the only clue to where the children had gone. He followed Nina in there. She turned to face the sobbing woman, holding tightly to the boy beside her that could only be her son and staring unblinkingly at the rocks. The little blonde boy went in after her, but neither of them has come out yet, and we heard more rumbling a minute ago. Tsunade thought she was going to be sick. No, no, no. Not her Naru-chan. He was fine. He was the strongest brat she'd ever seen, and she'd made sure he was well grounded in medical basics. There was no way a few rocks were going to kill her stupidly heroic son. Shizune caught her wrist before she could send a chakra-imbued punch into the rock pile to enlarge the opening. No. This area must be really unstable if there have been minor collapses twice in an hour, and this sort of rock is extremely fragile. Destroying more of the structure could bring it all down and crush them. You're right, Tsunade sighed, she needed to get it together. She obviously wasn't thinking clearly. Worry and fear were clouding her judgment. We're going to have to do it the hard way. She picked up a boulder the size of a small pony with one hand and threw it aside. The worried father, now comforting his wife and son, gaped on, completely stunned, then hurried to help them widen the opening. Shizune, go back to town and get us more help. Bring ropes and lights too. This cave must be pretty deep if they can't hear us calling to them, so we'll need a group of workers. Yes, of course. The younger woman scrambled to obey. The rest of Nina's family came forward to help move debris as best they could. Rescue at the beach. Naruto felt like he'd been walking for ages. His chest hurt with every breath, and even using his good arm to pin his bad one against his side wasn't killing the ache each jarring step sent through his injured limb. He'd stopped calling out to the lost Nina several minutes ago, when it got harder to catch his breath. He paused a moment, thinking he heard a whimpering from up ahead, and the sound of soft crying. "Nina, is that you? Hello? Yes. Is someone there?" A high, raspy voice choked with tears, cut through the darkness, and he strengthened his light in response. "I see you," she called, and he heard shuffling sounds from the tunnel in front of him as well as cheerful yipping. A tiny, furry white blur came tearing into his small circle of light and jumped around happily. He couldn't make her out yet, but it hadn't taken the dog long to get to him, so she must be pretty close. His light ruined his night vision, or he was sure he'd have been able to see her. "Hey, are you hurt?" he called, inching forwards. The sounds were getting closer, but he couldn't make her out yet. It was even harder to keep putting one foot in front of the other with Muffy dancing around his ankles. "Yes, I tripped in a hole in the dark after I slid down here, and I hurt my ankle. It was so awful, and I was so scared." A miniature version of the dark-haired woman he'd seen on the surface before this adventure began, finally limped into his light's small oasis, and the little girl gasped, "Your hand is glowing." Huh. His head was a little foggy from the light chakra sickness Kyuubi had induced in him before he'd tried to heal himself after the cave-in, so it took him a minute to think of why she'd think that was odd. "Oh, yeah, it's a jutsu. It's the only thing I have for light. Hey, are you a ninja? Can you get us out of here?" She looked so hopeful even with her dirt and tear-streaked face that he couldn't bring himself to be anything but entirely optimistic with her. "Of course I can. We've just got to get back out the way I came in. If we don't take any of the branches off of this tunnel, we should be fine." He tried to give her his best grin, but she seemed to sense he was bluffing. Aren't you kind of young to be a ninja? You can't be much older than me, and I'm only 7, and you look kind of hurt." "Well, I'm still in training, but this is nothing I can't handle. My Ka-san is a legendary medic nin, you know." She frowned, beginning to sniffle once more as the prospects of sudden rescue seemed to dim. "If your mom is such a great medic nin, why haven't you healed yourself?" Naruto sighed and slumped back against the wall. "So much for downplaying his injuries. My jutsu aren't that good yet, but man, am I going to fix that when I get out of here. But I could probably heal your ankle some, and take away most of the pain." "Really?" She brightened up a little again. "Help me sit down here, for a minute, and I'll take a look at it." "Okay." She gently took his arm and aided him into a sitting position, then lowered herself down beside him. "Should I take off my shoe?" "No. These rocks are sharp, and you'd never get it back on again if it's swollen. Just let me see it." He'd had lots of practice with sprained joints. It was a really common injury during training. He'd even eventually gotten the trick of the inflammation-reducing jutsu his Ka-san had wanted to teach him instead of the chakra scalpel. Unfortunately, it involved a few more hand signs than the jutsu he'd used on himself, and he was pretty sure he couldn't manage it in the state he was in. "The light's going to cut out for a minute, so don't be scared, okay? I gotta stop this technique to start up the healing one, but I'll get it going again as soon as I'm done." He saw her nod in understanding, and he tried to give her a reassuring grin. She looked pretty scared. "My name's Naruto, by the way." Thank you for coming to find me, Naruto-kun." He nodded, and painfully fumbled through the hand signs to activate the diagnostic jutsu. He had to make sure her ankle was the worst of it. Unfortunately, this one didn't give off any light, and Nina whimpered again in fear, "I want my daddy." Naruto knew the feeling. "He's up top, but he couldn't fit down here. Your family is waiting for you when we get out." She was really being braver than his former experience with civilian kids had led him to expect. Her dad had been pretty calm too. He wondered if the guy had a high-stress job. Aside from the ankle, she was covered in cuts and bruises. If he had to guess, he'd say she probably stumbled right to the edge of that nasty drop-off and rolled down because she couldn't see it in the dark. Her fall probably caused the rocks at the opening to come loose as well as weakened the floor enough to cause it to crumble on him when he'd gotten there, and she'd probably run in fear from the sound of his fall, ending up here. Her shins and hands were cut from feeling her way along the walls and bumping into rocks in the darkness. It only took him 3 tries to get the healing jutsu working this time, and when his hands began to glow green, he could see Muffy pressed comfortingly against his mistress's side. The dog's presence was probably why she wasn't as scared as he thought she'd be. She hadn't really been all alone in the dark like he had. "It's okay, I'm going to heal you now." She nodded and he placed his hands on her ankle. The swelling went down a little and she stopped whimpering so much, so it must have hurt less. "That's the best I can do when I'm like this," he murmured. "I've got to switch back to the other technique now, so the light is going to go off again." "Okay, thank you, Naruto-kun. It really does feel a little better, now." She hugged her puppy and squinched her eyes shut when the green glow stopped. After a few moments, she felt him touch her arm and peeked open an eye to see he'd gotten the blue light back. "It's all right." She impulsively lunged at him in a hug, and he did his best to stifle a cry of pain. Back on the beach, a whole crew of men were working with Tsunade to clear the rocks from the entrance to the cave. It wasn't easy going. The second collapse had caused most of the downward tunnel to fall in, so there was a long stretch of boulders to clear, and they had no idea how much farther they had to go before it opened back up. On top of that, they had to be extremely careful not to cause further damage to the area as they worked, or everything they'd done so far could be undone in moments. None of them were giving up hope because they hadn't found any bodies yet, but the families of both missing children were getting more and more frantic by the hour. Each rock they moved that only led to more rocks felt like another ton of weight on Tsunade's heart. Naruto didn't know if he could get up so soon after those jutsu, so they sat huddled in the blue glow of his chakra. Nina leaned against him along the cave's wall, shoulders touching, with her little dog sitting quietly for once in her lap. The ninja in training had his head back and his eyes closed, not looking forward to trying to get them all the way back to the hole they'd fallen down, let alone back up to the surface. He could only hope that his Ka-san would find them before that became necessary. He almost joined his companion in sniffling, but he was a shinobi and crying wouldn't help anyone. He decided to distract them both with conversation. Talking kind of hurt with his ribs like they were, but it would be worth a little pain to dispel this atmosphere. "If Daddy were here, everything would be fine," Nina whispered, obviously having been thinking along the same lines. Naruto was pretty sure his Ka-san would have been a lot more help in this situation than some richly dressed civilian tourist, but who knew, maybe Dad's had some special superpower to make everything better. It's not like he'd know, he thought bitterly. "I'm sure they are on their way. You probably didn't notice since you were running in the dark, but we covered a lot of ground between here and the opening." "I don't care. I want my mom and dad. I'm hungry, and wet, and cold, and I want my daddy." Naruto's eyes shot open. Now that she mentioned it, he was wet too, and it wasn't the lingering dampness from his training that morning. He lowered his hand a bit to better see the cave floor and found a thin layer of water seeping up from the pores in the stone. Nina turned to glare at him. "Don't use that kind of language in front of a lady, baka." From hero to baka, in under an hour. Naruto was pretty sure his life sucked. The cave is getting wetter, which means the tide must be coming in or something, making it fill up. "We've got to get back to higher ground as fast as we can," he gritted out through clenched teeth. "Oh," she repeated him. He refrained from commenting. Nina had a much easier time standing up than he did, despite her still slightly injured ankle, but he eventually managed to make it back to his feet. Little Muffy went scampering up back towards the entrance, his tiny paws splashing in the rising water. "Muffy, wait," the little girl gasped, "you'll get lost again." She grabbed Naruto's good arm and drug him off in that direction much faster than his injuries were comfortable with, but at least they were headed in the right direction. If they kept going uphill, he figured they'd have to find their way to the surface eventually. It was just a matter of moving faster than the water could fill the cavern. After about 100 yards they caught up to the little dog and Naruto's ribs were really burning. He wondered if he'd managed to damage them more with all of his movement. His chakra scalpel was starting to waver and water was leaking in through the walls as well as the floor. Both children were shivering and soaked clear through. Muffy whimpered and backed up against Nina's legs, tail tucked firmly underneath him, and Naruto got a really bad feeling about this. There was a snapping noise and one of the side tunnels they'd passed through earlier suddenly spewed a wave of frigid saltwater into the main passage. One of the walls in that direction had obviously been weakened and worn through. "Run," he gasped, forcing himself to scoop up Muffy, and he and Nina took off as fast as they could away from the rising water. "We've got to hurry," one of the workmen said, "it's getting late and the tide is coming in." Most of these caves flood to one degree or another whenever that happens. We haven't seen signs of flooding in this passage yet, but there's no telling what those collapses earlier might have caused. This igneous rock is never the same 2 days in a row, anyway. It's so porous the ocean washes it right away half the time. Shizune tried to keep her calm, and nodded, glancing over to where Tsunade was doing the work of 3 larger men with her chakra-enhanced strength. It didn't look like she'd heard the worker's comment, and that could only be a good thing. Her hands were all ready from the sharp edges of the stones and she was currently only stopping to heal herself when she was cut deeply enough to slow her down. The workmen had only brought enough gloves for themselves. There was no telling what this news might do to Shizune's emotionally fragile mentor. She didn't think any of them could work faster than they already were. Or through. Someone called from the front of the line, and both medic Nin took off down the passage like their feet were on fire. Nina's father was as tight on their heels as a civilian man could be. Behind them, the gathered crowd from the village that had come to see what the excitement was all about, and then stayed to find out if they could help and see how things turned out, began to buzz with the news. "Pass us some more light," the worker called, while Tsunade took over for him, shoving stones out of the way, and passing them backwards to teams of men behind them. The tiny hole grew bigger and with the added light sources, they could finally see a room of rock opening up on the other side of the piled barrier. 2 more large stones shuffled back to be carried clear, and the passage was large enough to squeeze through. "Go on ahead," the worker said, "we'll shore up the entrance and send more people in after you." "Good. Make sure there's food and blankets waiting up here. They'll be tired and hungry, and probably dehydrated when we get them out." He nodded and passed the word along as the 2 women and 1 worried father crawled head first into the cave clutching flashlights and carrying ropes. They hadn't gone very far when Tsunade, who had been in front, suddenly called a halt. "There's a big hole here leading down. There's nothing on the other side of it. They must be down there." Shizune inched forward and looked over the ledge, shining her flashlight down the nearly vertical incline. "My poor Nina. Do you think they fell?" Tsunade looked grim, but years of stressful medical work dealing with life and death situations let her regain some semblance of calm now that it felt like they were making progress towards saving the kids. "Yes, and there's water down there, which means at least part of the tunnel system is flooded. Find something sturdy to tie the rope to, and then you're going to stay up here to haul us up once we find the children. An untrained man would be useless down there and probably get them all killed." "Oh, okay." He jumped to do as he was told, desperate to do something to help his daughter. Shizune gave her mentor a look, and then easily leapt down into the water below. 20 feet wasn't anything for a well-trained ninja as long as they were expecting it. The water came up to her waist. Tsunade easily leapt down beside her and after exchanging quick glances, they took off down the tunnel. The water got higher and higher on them as they walked, but the ceilings were high too. Hopefully the children had found a ledge or something to climb on and wait out the worst of it since they hadn't made it this far. "And Naruto. Naruto-kun, please wake up." He felt someone shaking his shoulder and a sudden urge to throw up made him turn away from the voice. He nearly fell off the side of a rock ledge, but a hand caught at what was left of his shirt and kept him from going over while he emptied the contents of his stomach. A horribly painful coughing fit took him right afterwards and by the time the person with him managed to ease him back onto his back, he kind of wanted to die. His good hand fumbled for his ninja pouch, hoping to wash the taste of blood out of his mouth with one of the bottles of water he kept there, but it was missing. "If you're looking for your water, I think you lost your pouch in the flood," the voice said. He thought she must have heard him searching for it. It was too dark to see, but his fuzzy mind provided him with a picture of a girl just younger than him with dark hair and eyes in clothes ragged from her impromptu spelunking trip in a fuzzy white puppy. "And Nina," he managed to gasp. "What happened? You don't remember?" She sounded really worried and fumbled to touch his forehead in the dark. It was the only thing even slightly warm in the entire place. She shivered and wrapped her arms back around her freezing body, pressing a bit closer to Muffy. "We didn't make it out of that part of the cave before it flooded. It was really scary, but you grabbed me and we followed Muffy. We were underwater for a long time, and I thought he'd drowned, but he got out before the opening was covered. We swam through it into this cave where the ceiling is higher, but the currents down there are really bad and we kept banging into things. Why you seem to be trying to keep yourself between me and the walls." Eventually we finally surfaced, and I heard Muffy barking. I was so tired and couldn't swim anymore, and it was so dark. I was sure we were going to die, but you pulled us over towards the noise and found some ledges after you got your hand to glow again. There's littler ones all along the walls and we managed to get all the way up here, but now we're trapped and it's still dark and I don't think we can get any higher. I felt around the wall after we reached this one and you passed out, but I couldn't find anything. He heard tears in her voice, and it was shaky with fear. After you stopped moving, I thought you were dead. This weird red smoke started rising up from your body, and after a while, it stopped, but then you started shaking really badly and acted like you couldn't breathe. You've been coughing like that ever since. Chakra sickness. He gasped his Ka-san's name for what Kyuubi's energy fighting with his own did to his system. He must have had to use chakra to reinforce his body to get them through the currents and take the hits against the cave walls when the currents she talked about had taken them. Now that he knew what had happened, flashes of stone and water and pain flooded back into his memory. He'd cushioned them against several pretty bad hits. It was no wonder Kyuubi had had to step in, but this was really bad timing. Okay. What can I do? She whimpered. Can you make the light again? No. His teeth had begun to chatter. Sorry, G get closer, warmth. Oh, of course. He felt her arms go around him and even though she wasn't careful of the injuries the Kyuubi hadn't been able to fully heal before his system had pushed it back, he felt a little better for the tangible human presence and what little warmth she could give him. Muffy whined softly in the darkness. Out of the deep, Tsunade and Shizune treaded water, their hair plastered to their heads and their bodies freezing. I think the water stopped rising. The younger woman gasped, looking over at her mentor in the light of their waterproof flashlights. True, but this room dead ends here. We're going to have to find the entrance to the next one under the waterline, or wait until it goes back down, and who knows how long that will take. At least we know he's still alive. His chakra signature is still more or less coming from that direction. She gestured towards the blank wall. They'd begun to be able to sense him almost as soon as they'd entered the cavern before this one. Actually, they weren't really separate caverns but one long tunnel with walls of rock near the ceiling currently blocking it off into sections. Shizune thought this shaft was probably created by air bubbles in molten rock back when this whole part of the country had been a massive lava flow. He is still alive, but he's getting weaker. We don't have time to wait for the water to go down. There's no telling how long that will take. Tsunade argued. Shizune nodded in agreement and both women took deep breaths, immediately submerging themselves. There was so much dirt and other debris in the water, that their lights were useless down there. They found themselves feeling along the wall, looking for an opening. Fortunately, they were ninja and could hold their breaths for several minutes before needing to surface for fresh air, but it still took them 3 tries to locate the hole connecting this ancient bubble in the stone to the next one. Tsunade found it first and was able to lead Shizune to it once they'd surfaced again. Some of these connecting ledges were thicker than others and there was no telling how long it would take them to get to the other side. At least with the water receding, they weren't fighting the currents quite so badly anymore. That made it much easier. As they neared the surface, they could both hear an excited voice echoing around the room, "Light, Naruto-kun. Wake up. There's light in the water." Tsunade broke the surface and sucked air into her burning lungs. She quickly unfastened the light from her belt where she had stored it for the swim and hurriedly directed it towards the sound. Beside her, Shizune did the same. "Over here. Please help us. Naruto-kun is really sick." The lights landed on a small girl leaning over a ledge on the wall, and a small white dog began to run back and forth yapping excitedly. "You must be Nina." The Sannin gasped, still trying to catch her breath from the swim, but pulling herself up out of the water with no visible sign of effort. Shizune followed after her with similar ease. The blonde woman didn't spare the little girl another thought before kneeling down next to the shivering and moaning little boy laid out along the wall of the cave. Her apprentice paused to look Nina over and a quick medical jutsu soon had her healed of her most serious scrapes and bruises, though there was nothing they could do about the cold just yet. "Why don't you tell us what happened while Tsunade-sama works on Naruto-kun, Nina-chan?" Shizune murmured, pulling the girl into her lap. Tsunade would have told her if there were anything she could do for Naruto other than get in the Sannin's way. Nina snuggled into the woman's comforting arms. Finally, adults. These had to be Naruto-kun's aunt and mother. They were all but saved. See, can't we get out of here first? Shizune shook her head, hating to disappoint the girl. No, not until the water goes down. You both have been through a lot and the trip back will be tough like this. It'll be much safer to wait. Okay, but I'm so hungry and thirsty, and I want my mommy and daddy. Her voice caught on a sob again, but she calmed down to the feel of a warm hand rubbing her back. Shish, Nina-chan, it'll be fine now. We won't have to wait too long. Tell us what happened, okay? Shizune pulled a bottle of water out of her pouch, wishing she had food, but everything got soaked during the swim. Well, it all started when my stupid brother threw the ball at the rocks, and Muffy followed it down here. I went in to get him, because I didn't want him to get lost, but it was dark, and I didn't see the drop-off. It was so steep that I practically fell down it. It was awful, but Muffy was waiting for me at the bottom. He must have slid down too because he was all dirty and limping a little. She paused in her tail to sniffle and pet the dog's fur. It jumped up into their laps. That's when the rocks started to fall. I could hear them at the entrance and things were shaking, so I ran away as fast as I could. I had to follow the walls because it was so dark, but I knew I had to get away from the rocks. Muffy came with me and we got pretty far. I made sure not to go into the side tunnels so I could find my way back, but I fell and hurt my ankle when the second rumbling happened. Naruto-kun found me and healed my ankle a little after a little while, but then he seemed really tired and he was hurt so we rested some more. Nina stopped to take a breath and gather herself for the rest of her tale. When we noticed the water, we had to run, but we couldn't. It was so scary and soon Muffy had to swim. I held onto him as long as I could, but the currents got bad and we ended up swimming too. Then the water filled the cave and we couldn't find Muffy so we swam towards the entrance, but with the currents and the dark, I didn't think we'd get there. Naruto-kun saved us, but we were all banged around the whole room. Muffy was barking, but we couldn't find the surface of the water. I thought I was going to die, but then Naruto-kun pulled me up to the air again. He wasn't swimming so well anymore, and I thought I wouldn't be able to go on, but we went where we could hear Muffy, and found a ledge. Naruto-kun managed to get his light working for a little while, and somehow we climbed up from shelf to shelf until we got here, but that's when he got really sick. I was so worried. Tsunade listened to the story with half an ear as she worked over her son. He was nearly completely covered with bruises and gashes of varying depths and his chakra reserves were low. He must have been using it for the light she talked about. He'd obviously been bashed against the walls on top of whatever damage he'd taken getting to the girl in the first place. It was hard to tell what had happened and when, with the varying levels of healing that had been done by his sloppy medical jutsu and Kyuubi's power. There was nothing life-threatening left to heal, but the girl had it right, he was very sick. She hadn't seen him with chakra sickness this bad before. His breath wheezed in and out of his lungs and blood flecked his lips. He was freezing, but she knew he'd be feverish once they got him warmed up enough for that. He hadn't even opened his eyes when she started working on him, and with his chakra senses being as good as they were, he always woke up when someone started working on him. He said other people's chakra tingled like the Kyuubi's did so he could always feel it working through him. He'd gotten so used to keeping track of his own chakra and any of the foxes that might try to get through, that he was very sensitive to anything that didn't naturally belong there. How fast is the water going down? She asked, not willing to pause what she was doing to check herself. Shizune craned her neck to look over the ledge. We'll be here for another few hours, I'd guess. We've got to get him warmed up. Her too, and us. We're all freezing. Tsunade frowned and picked Naruto up to cradle him in her lap like her apprentice was doing with the little girl. She accepted the water bottle from her and gently tipped some of it into Naruto's mouth before taking a few swallows of her own and passing it back. Do you have enough chakra left to burn it high enough for the both of you to warm up? Shizune frowned, her brows furrowing. I don't know. I've got enough for a little while, but not for 2 hours. Well, do what you can. Their little corner of the cave lit up in brilliant blue as their auras flared. The light show had definitely begun to waver a bit by the time they heard voices. All 4 of them had been lulled into near dozing states by the lingering cold and constant high chakra expenditure of the 2 women. The water was still too high to show more than a sliver of the flashlights, beams from the people on the other side of the divider, but help was definitely on the way. The 2 women immediately perked up, hearing the sounds of oars as well as voices. They'd brought a boat. "We're in here," Shizune called. "Nina." The distinctive voice of her father rang out, only slightly muffled by the rock and echoing around the caverns. "She's all right, or will be as soon as we get her warmed up." "How fast is the water level going down?" "We've just gotten them dry, so it would be a bad idea to swim them over, but they need to get out and into beds as quickly as possible." Tsunade let Shizune do the talking. She was much better in these kinds of situations. Now that the adrenaline had worn off and she knew they'd all be safe and warm in a little bit, reactionary nerves were starting to kick in, and she found herself clutching her little boy to her like death would reach out to steal him away at any moment. "It's falling fast now. We should be able to get through in a half-hour or so. Will they be all right until then?" A scuffle was heard, as someone obviously had to keep Nina's father from jumping into the water and swimming through the still very narrow gap to get to her. "Yes, that'll be fine," Shizune called back, then glanced over the sleeping little girl in her lap to get a look at her mentor. "We should move down to the lowest ledge above the waterline." Tsunade nodded and levered herself up with her precious burden. The two women easily leapt along the niches in the cave wall down to the lowest unsubmerged rock ledge. A small wait, a boat ride, and a lift up a 20-feet ledge and the same boat on a pulley system later, and they were back in the open air. There was a loud roar of a cheering crowd when they made their way out of the newly opened tunnel system, but Tsunade ignored it, swearing if she ever saw another cave, it would be too soon. They quickly bundled both children up and accepted blankets for themselves while hurrying over to one of the fires that had been started on the beach. The sun fell lower in the sky as the moon got higher. The adventure had taken nearly a whole day, and the kids had been wet, battered, starved, and freezing for most of it. They'd both be lucky if they came out of this without pneumonia. Leave it to Naruto to get pneumonia in the subtropics. Nina's family surrounded her in a crying hugging heap of people passing her back and forth, and she was smothered with affection in all the blankets and clean dry clothing they could acquire before they even made it over to the fire pit. "Get some of that soup into her as soon as you can." Tsunade barked across the excited crowd. This had turned into a pretty big spectacle. It looked like the whole town had turned out to see how the disaster ended. Taking her own advice, she accepted a bowl from a smiling woman and immediately began to spoon it into Naruto's slack mouth. His cheeks were flushing now with fever, but at least he was warmer. His head lay limply against her shoulder, but he swallowed on his own, and his breathing was a little easier. One of the nurses they worked with in the hospital crouched down to see if they needed anything else, and Shizune shook her head after a quick glance at her mentor. "No, he was hurt pretty badly, but he'll be okay now." "How is Nina?" "She's fine," Shizune-san. Chattering her adventure to everyone who will listen. "It sounds like your nephew there is a real hero." The woman grinned. "I'm so glad everything worked out all right." Shizune winced, glad Tsunade was too busy with Naruto to pay attention to their conversation. "I'm glad it worked out too, but don't let Tsunade hear you call Naru-chan a hero. She's kind of touchy about the word." The nurse blinked, but wasn't really surprised. Tsunade-sama was a brilliant woman. Really strange, but brilliant. Okay. Will you be taking him home, or should I go make up a bed at the hospital?" "Tsunade-sama will want him at home. Better count on just one of us taking shifts for the next few days. This illness is somewhat chronic, and it takes him about a week to get over the really rough part of it." She nodded and stood up. "I'll talk to the shift manager, but I'm sure it will be fine. Take care of him, and let me know if there's anything any of us can do. We're all eager to help." Shizune smiled in gratitude. "Thank you, I appreciate it, and I know Sensei does too." 3 days after they'd been pulled out of the cave, Naruto finally woke up. It was the middle of the night, and with the blinds pulled, for a moment he was afraid he was still in the cave. The dim light in the room eventually began to make things take shape for him, and he realized the weight on his legs was Taunton, and the breaths he could hear were his Ka-san's. She'd fallen asleep in the chair beside the bed again. She did that a lot, even when he wasn't sick. She never wanted to talk about it, but it wasn't rare for him to find her dozing there sometimes if he woke up especially early in the mornings. He was achy all over, and his breath burned in the way it always did when he was chakra sick. He could hardly keep his eyes open, he was so weak, so he let them fall closed, secure in the fact that everything would still be okay when he woke up. The sweet smell of ramen roused him the next morning, and he found a tray of his favorite miso-flavored noodle white treat sitting with a glass of milk over his legs. His Ka-san's smiling face greeted him, and she kissed his forehead. "Welcome back to the land of the living, Squirt. Think you can eat something for me?" He paused a moment to think about it. It smelled so good, but sometimes he couldn't choke anything down for a while after an attack like that. Finally he nodded, his assessment of himself telling him he was better enough to fill his stomach without losing his cookies. "That's my boy." She gently ruffled his hair, careful not to jostle him too much, and set off a headache that could leave him incapacitated for hours, then scooted the tray closer to him and pulled him up into a semi-sitting position so he could eat it. His hands shook a little, but he was strong enough to work the chopsticks on his own, so she let him have it, watching him like she was afraid he'd disappear at any moment if she so much as blinked. "Or putting the Sozo Seisei Genesis Rebirth seal on you tomorrow, brat." He paused with a glob of noodles halfway to his mouth and raised an eyebrow at her in question. He knew better than to talk until his throat healed from all the coughing he'd no doubt done in however long he'd been asleep. "You could have died in there because Kyuubi had to heal you. If you'd had my seal, you could have prevented that. It's too dangerous for a ninja to be incapacitated so quickly after a wound. Times like these may happen on missions where you won't be able to get medical help but need to keep going." He sighed and finished taking the halted bite of noodles. "Don't argue with me. It's for your own good." He rolled his eyes. "I'm your mother, and I know what's best." Now he stuck his tongue out. "Why you?" Shizune groaned from the doorway. Even when Naruto was too sick to speak, they still managed to have arguments. She cleared her throat, and the Senju stopped tormenting each other to look in her direction. "Naru-chan's got a visitor." She grinned and stepped aside to let a little dark-haired girl in her fluffy white dog barrel excitedly through the doorway and bounce onto the bed. Nina's father watched protectively from behind Shizune and carefully set a loosely wrapped gift on a side table just inside the room. "Naruto-kun, you're awake. I was so worried. Muffy was too. We brought you a present, and I picked it out myself." The little dog barked at the mention of his name, and Tsunade reached over to steady the tray of food before the children and pet could upset it. Nina's father leaned over to Shizune and whispered, "The gift is an ivy plant. It symbolizes affection," and it reminded her of the designs on his face. He grinned a bit. "I think it's very cute." Shizune looked shocked for a moment, and then had to stifle giggles. She couldn't wait until Naruto opened his gift. Hopefully it wouldn't try to strangle him. "Nina's been to visit you every day since we got you out," Tsunade said with a grin, unaware of what was going on in the doorway, and then she leaned over to whisper in her son's ear, "I think she likes you." Naruto made a horrible face, and she burst out laughing. "I'll just take this away for now. You can have the rest when Nina-chan goes home." She stood to carry the tray to the kitchen past the two other adults now standing in the hall. Shizune went into the room to make sure Nina didn't get Naruto too riled up while he was still so weak and sick, and the girl's father followed the Sannin. "We don't know how to thank you," he murmured when he'd gotten Tsunade's attention. "Your son saved our Nina's life. She'd have drowned, for sure if it weren't for him. If there's anything I can ever do," he stuck his hand out to her, and she accepted it nonchalantly. "That's just how Naru-chan is. He can't help it. It's a genetic defect." The man looked confused for several moments, then grinned a little and scratched at the back of his neck. "Well, anyway, if you're ever in water country and need help, just ask for the daimyo's brother." He grinned. "This is the last time we take a vacation at the shore like normal tourists." Tsunade blinked. "Daimyo's brother. Naru-chan knows how to pick them." "Yes, well, the pleasure is all mine. Senju Tsunade of the legendary Sannin." He winked, and then spun on a heel. "Nina-chan, it's time to go. Naruto-kun is sick and needs his rest, and we have to meet up with our guards for the trip back to the capital." "Coming, Daddy." They were gone without further fanfare. "Guards." Shizune came out of Naruto's room, blinking in surprise. "Naruto-kun's little friend is the daimyo of Water Country's niece." "Oh. For some reason, I'm not surprised." Shizune laughed, and then reached for the oddly shaped package their guests had left behind and carried it over to her grumpy-looking nephew. "Here, Naru-chan, open up Nina's present." Naruto accepted the gift with a weird look at the two adults and tentatively began to unwrap it. As soon as he had the paper opened at the top, A vine of ivy came streaking out and wrapped itself around his arm, curling up to his face to affectionately nuzzle his cheek. The boy made a strangled, ing sound of surprise and Shizune began to giggle. Tsunade rolled her eyes and went to help untangle her son. The vine was tenacious though, and seemed extremely upset about being pulled away. How she could tell that the plant was upset, she wasn't quite sure, but it just sort of felt that way. Naruto looked pleadingly up at her from his entangled state and she couldn't help but join her apprentice in laughing. I'm afraid it likes you, Naruto. You'll just have to keep it. He sighed and glared down at the delicate leaves now laying innocently against his chest, though he could feel a second tendril sneak up to pet his hair. He scowled. Why did this always happen? It was so thoroughly annoying, and his guardians got far too much amusement out of it. They'd begun clinging to each other because they were laughing so hard at the petting. It wasn't fair. Ivy nuzzled his neck in sympathy. This is all your fault, he mouthed silently at the plant, but it didn't seem chastised in the least.